Letter 13. Containing a description of the north of Scotland. Fife and Perth. Sir, I am now to enter the true and real Caledonia, for the country on the north of the Firth is alone called by that name, and was anciently known by no other. As I shall give an account of it as it is, and not as it was, so I shall describe it as I viewed it, not as other people have viewed it. Nor shall I confine myself to the division of the country, as the geographers have divided it, or to the shires and counties, as the civil authority has divided it, or into presbyteries and synodical provinces. As the Church has divided it, but noting the shires where I find them needful, I shall give an account of things in the order of my own progress, and as I passed through, or visited them. I went over the Firth at the Queen's Ferry, a place mentioned before, 7 miles west of Edinburgh. And, as he that gives an account of the country of Fife, must necessarily go round the coast, the most considerable places being to be seen on the seaside, or near it, so I took that method, and began at the Queen's Ferry. A mile from hence, or something more, is the borough of Innerkeithen, an antient walled town, with a spacious harbour, opening from the east part of the town into the Firth of Forth. The mouth of the harbour has a good depth of water, and ships of burthen may ride there with safety. But as there is not any great trade here, and consequently no use for shipping of burthen, the harbour has been much neglected. However, small vessels may come up to the quay, such as are sufficient for their business. The town is large and is still populous, but decayed, as to what it has formerly been, yet the market for linen not only remains, but is rather more considerable than formerly, by reason of the increase of that manufacture since the Union. The market for provisions is also very considerable here, the country round being very fruitful, and the families of gentlemen being also numerous in the neighbourhood. There was a tragical story happened in this town, which made it more talked of in England, at that time, than it had been before. The Lord Burleigh, a young nobleman, but not then come to his estate, his father being living, had, it seems, had some love affair with a young woman in his father's family, but could not prevail with her to sacrifice her virtue to him. Upon which the affair being made public she was removed out of the family, and he was persuaded to travel, or whether he went into the army, I do not remember. He had declared, it seems, before he went abroad, that he would marry her at his return. Which, however, it seems the young woman declined too, as being too much below his quality, and that she would not be a dishonour to the family, but he not only declared he would marry her, but, upon that answer of hers, added, that if any one else married her, he would murder them as soon as he came back. This passed without much notice, and the young woman was married, before his return, to a schoolmaster in this town of Innerkeithen. After some time the young master, so they call the eldest son of a lord, while his father is living, of Burleigh, returns from his travels, and inquiring for the young woman, and being told she was married, and to whom. Retaining his hellish resolution he rides away to the town, and up to the school door, and calling for the schoolmaster, the innocent man came out to him unarmed in a gown and slippers. When, after asking if he was such a one, and flying out in some hard words upon him, he drew his pistol, and shot the poor man dead upon the spot, riding away in the open day, and nobody daring to meddle with him. But justice pursuing him, and a proclamation being issued, with a reward of 200 for apprehending him, he was at last taken, and was tried at Edinburgh by the Lords of the Justiciary, and condemned to have his head cut off, and the day of execution appointed. Nor could all the intercession of his family and friends prevail with the Queen, after her Majesty had a true account of the fact laid before her, to pardon or reprieve him, but the day before the execution his friends found means for him to make his escape out of the Tolbooth of Edinburgh, disguised in his sister's clothes. In return for this deliverance he appeared in the late rebellion, and was in the battle of Dumlane or Sheriffmuir, but got off again, and his estate, which, however, was but small, was forfeited among the rest. But the murderer is not yet brought to justice. This tragedy, and its circumstances, I think, merits to be recorded, and the rather, because most of the circumstances came within the verge of my knowledge, and I was upon the spot when it was done. There are many other circumstances in it, but too long to be repeated. Near Innerkeithen, a little within the land, stands the antient town of Dunfermline, as I may say, in my Lord Rochester's words, in its full perfection of decay. Nay, the decay is threefold. Here is a decayed monastery, for before the Reformation here was a very large and famous abbey, but demolished at the Revolution. And saving, that part of the church was turned into a parochial church, the rest, and greatest part of that also lies in ruins, and with it the monuments of several kings and queens of Scotland, particularly that of Malcolm III, who founded the monastery, as does also the cloister and apartments for the religious people of the house, great part of which are yet so plain to be seen, as to be distinguished one from another. Here is a decayed court or royal palace of the kings of Scotland. They do not tell us who built this palace, but we may tell them who suffers it to fall down. For it is now, as it was observed before, all the royal houses are, sinking into its own ruins, the windows are gone, the roof fallen in, and part of the very walls mouldered away by the injury of time, and of the times. In this palace almost all King James the Fifth's children were born, as particularly King Charles I and the Princess Elizabeth, afterwards Queen of Bohemia. And their mother, which was Queen and daughter of the Queen of Denmark, made this place her particular residence, which was also settled upon her as her dower or jointure. Here she built herself an apartment, consisting of 8 rooms over the arch of the great gate, which were her particular retirement, having a gallery reaching from that apartment to the royal lodgings. The figure of the house remains, but as for the lodgings they are all, as I have said, in their decay, and we may now call it the monument of a court. Here is a decayed town, and we need go no farther for that part than the decay of the palace, which is irrecoverable. There might be something said here of what was done at this town, upon receiving and crowning King Charles II. By the Covenanters, and which might, perhaps, contribute to entail a disgust upon the house, and even upon the place. And if it did so, I see no reason to blame the king on that account, for the memory of the place could not be pleasant to his majesty for many reasons, but this is matter of history, and besides, it seems to have something in it that is not perhaps so well to be remembered as to be forgot. The church has still a venerable face, and at a distance seems a mighty pile, the building being once vastly large, what is left appears too gross for the present dimensions. The church itself, they tell us, was as long as the Cathedral of Carlisle, designed by the model of that of Glasgow, though, I rather think, that at Glasgow, was designed by the model of that at Dunfermline, for the last was, by far, the most antient. The people hereabout are poor, but would be much poorer, if they had not the manufacture of linen for their support, which is here, and in most of the towns about, carried on with more hands than ordinary, especially for diaper. And the better sort of linen, the Marquis of Tweedale has a good estate in these parts, and is hereditary housekeeper, or porter of the royal house, and, in effect, Lord Chamberlain. From hence, turning east, we see many seats of private gentlemen, and some of noblemen, as particularly one belonging to the said Marquis of Tweedale at Aberdour. It was formerly one of the many noble mansion houses of the great Earl Moortown, Regent, but with his fall the estates found new masters, as that of Dalkeith has in the house of Buccleuch, and this of Aberdour in the house of Yester, or Tweedale. The house is old, but magnificent, and the lands about it, as all must do, that come into the managing hands of the family of Tweedale, have been infinitely improved by planting and enclosing. This house of Aberdour fronts the Firth to the south, and the grounds belonging to it reach down to the shores of it. From this part of the Firth, to the mouth of Innerkeithen Harbour, is a very good road for ships, the water being deep and the ground good, but the western part, which they call St. Margaret's Bay, is a steep shore, and rocky, there being 20 fathom water within a ship's length of the rocks, so that in case of a south-east wind, and if it blow hard, it may be dangerous riding too near. But a south-east wind blows so seldom, that the ships often venture it, and I have seen large ships ride there. He that will view the country of Fife must, as I said before, go round the coast. And yet there are 4 or 5 places of note in the middle of the country which are superior to all the rest, and must not be omitted. I'll take them as I go, though I did not travel to them in a direct line. The names are as follow. Kinross, the house of Sir William Bruce, Leslie, Falkland, Melville, Balgony, and Cooper. The last a town, the other great houses, and one a royal palace, and once the most in request of all the royal houses in Scotland, and here, since I am upon generals, it may not be improper to mention, as a remark only, that however mean our thoughts in England have been of the Scots court in those times, the kings of Scotland had more fine palaces than most princes in Europe, and, in particular, many more than the crown of England has now. For example, we see nothing in England now of any notice but Hampton Court, Windsor, Kensington, and St. James's. Greenwich and none such are demolished. Richmond quite out of use, and not able to receive a court. Winchester never inhabited, or half finished. Whitehall burnt, and lying in ruins, or, as we may say, let out into tenements. Westminster, long since abandoned, so that I say nothing remains but, as above, St. James's, Kensington, Windsor, and Hampton Court. Whereas the kings of Scotland had in King James V's time all in good repair, and in use, the several royal palaces of Holyrood House at Edinburgh, the Castle, the Royal Palace in the Castle at Stirling, Linlithgow, Dunfermline, Falkland, Scone. Besides lesser seats and hunting houses, of which King James V had several, and besides the several palaces of the Earl Moortown and others, which were forfeited into the king's hands, and which afterwards became royal. Having seen Aberdour, I took a turn, at a friend's invitation, to Leslie, but by the way stopped at Kinross, where we had a view of two things worth noting. The famous lake or loch, called Loch Leven, where, in an island, stands the old castle where Queen Mary, commonly known in England by the name of Queen of Scots, was confined by the first reformers, after she had quitted, or been forced to quit her favourite Bothwell, and put herself into the hands of her subjects. One would have thought this castle, standing as it were in the middle of the sea, for so it is in its kind, should have been sufficient to have held her, but she made shift to get out of their hands, whether by a silver key, or without a key, I believe is not fully known to this day. The loch itself is worth seeing, 'tis very large, being above 10 miles about, and in some places deep, famous for fish. Formerly it had good salmon, but now chiefly trouts and other small fish. Out of it flows the river Leven, which runs from thence to Leslie. At the west end of the lake, and the gardens reaching down to the very water's edge, stands the most beautiful and regular piece of architecture, for a private gentleman's seat, in all Scotland, perhaps, in all Britain. I mean the house of Kinross. The town lies at a little distance from it, so as not to annoy the house, and yet so as to make it the more sociable, and at the town is a very good market, and the street tolerably well built. The house is a picture, 'tis all beauty. The stone is white and fine, the order regular, the contrivance elegant, the workmanship exquisite. Dryden's lines, intended for a compliment on his friend's poetry, and quoted before, are literally of the house of Kinross. Strong Doric columns form the base. Corinthian fills the upper space. So all below is strength, and all above is grace. Sir William Bruce, the skilful builder, was the Surveyor General of the Works, as we call it in England, or the Royal Architect, as in Scotland. In a word, he was the Kit Wren of North Britain. And his skill in the perfect decoration of building, has many testimonials left upon record for it, such as the Palace of Holyrood at Edinburgh, the House of Rothes, and this at Kinross, besides several others. The situation of this house of Kinross would be disliked by some for its being so very near the water, and that sometimes when the lake is swelled by winter rains and melted snows, the water comes into, or at least unto the very gardens. But as the country round is dry, free from stagnated bogs, and unhealthy marshes, this little Mediterranean sea gives them very little inconvenience, if any. Sir William, according to the new and laudable method of all the Scots gentlemen, has planted innumerable numbers of fir trees upon the estate round his house, and the present possessor Mr. Bruce, is as careful to improve as his predecessor. Posterity will find the sweet of this passion for planting, which is so happily spread among the people of the south parts of Scotland, and which, if it goes on, will in time make Scotland a second Norway for fur. For the lowlands, as well as the highlands, will be overspread with timber. Nor may it require so many ages as some people imagine, for many of the largest and most considerable improvements are already of 50 to 70 and 80 years standing, as at Melville, Leslie, Yester, Pinkie, Newbattle, and several other places. And others follow apace. So that in 40 or 50 years more, as slow a growing wood as fir is, yet there may be a quantity of large-grown trees to be found to begin upon, so as to cut out deal-boards in great numbers, besides spars, balks, poles, oars and which the branches will supply. From Kinross, I came to Leslie, where I had a full view of the Palace of Rothes, both inside and outside, as I had before of that of Bruce. The magnificence of the inside at Leslie is unusually great. But what is very particular, is the long gallery, which is the full length of one side of the building, and is filled with paintings, but especially, as at Drumlanrig, of the great ancestors of the House of Rothes or Leslie at full lengths. And in their robes of office or habits of ceremony. Particularly the late Duke of Rothes, who built the house, and who was Lord High Chancellor of Scotland. I do not forget that the rooms of state at Kinross are well supplied with pictures and some very fine and valuable pieces, as particularly those of King Charles I and Henrietta Maria his Queen Daughter of France. But almost if not all the full lengths in this gallery of Rothes, are of the family, and the immediate ancestors from whom in a direct line the present Earl is descended, having been peers. And in some or other of the greatest offices of trust in Scotland, from the year 1320 to 1725. So that there may well be enough to clothe a gallery, and they are there to be distinguished by their robes and different habits down to the great founder of the house, who was Lord High Commissioner to the Parliament, Lord High Treasurer, and Lord Chancellor. And was created a duke for his own life only, so that his successors are now but earls, but the family are still in the highest esteem, and have gone through divers posts of honour and trust. The house indeed is magnificent. I cannot say the situation is so much to advantage as some other seats, nor is there any large avenue or prospect from the entrance, but it is a prospect in itself. It is situated on the banks of the Leven just where another smaller river joins it, and the park on the south side of the house is very beautiful, 6 miles in circumference, walled about, and in several parts. Little woods of fir trees planted with vistas reaching to them from the house, which gives a very beautiful prospect. The gardens are at the end of the house well planted, and well designed, extending to the angle or point, where the two rivers meet. So that the gardens are as it were watered on the north and on the east side, and on the south side are parted from the park with a wall, the west end of them beginning from the house. This house was built for the Duke mentioned above, in the reign of King Charles II. By that man of art and master of building Sir William Bruce mentioned there also, so that the building is wholly modern. It is a square, and the fronts every way are plain, that is, without wings, and make a square court within. Here it was King James II lodged, most part of the time, when he was obliged by his brother, King Charles II, to retire into Scotland while he was Duke of York, and his apartments are marked in the house and called the Duke of York's lodgings to this day. They had a communication with the long gallery, and with the great staircase at the other end. The town of Leslie is at a small distance west from the house or a little northwest. There is a good market, but otherwise it is not considerable. The house is the glory of the place, and indeed of the whole province of Fife. From Leslie, we turned away south to the coast, and came to Brunt Island. This is a port upon the Firth of Forth, and lies opposite to Leith, so that there is a fair prospect as well of the road of Leith, and the ships riding there, as of the city and castle or Edinburgh. There is a very good harbour which enters as if it had been made by hand into the centre of the town, for the town is as it were built round it, and the ships lay their broadsides to the very houses. There is water enough at spring tides for ships of good burthen to come into the basin, but at low water some of the ships lie aground, but want of trade renders all this useless, for what is the best harbour in the world without ships? And whence should ships be expected without a commerce to employ them? It is true, the ships of several other towns on the coast frequently put into this harbour, to lay up, as we call it, and to lie by in the winter, but this does not so much better the town as to make it be called a trading town. So that, indeed, the place is unhappy, and must decay yet farther, unless the trade revive, which, I confess, I do not yet foresee. Here is, however, a manufacture of linen, as there is upon all the coast of Fife, and especially for that they call green cloth, which is now in great demand in England for the printing trade, in the room of calicoes, which were lately prohibited. Next to this is Kinghorn upon the same coast, where, not the sea, but the manufacture upon the land may be said to maintain the place, for here is a thread manufacture, which they make very good, and bleach or whiten it themselves. The women, indeed, chiefly carry on this trade, and the men are generally seamen upon all this coast, as high as the Queen's Ferry. Where I observed the men carried on an odd kind of trade, or sport rather, viz. of shooting of porpoises, of which very great numbers are seen almost constantly in the Firth. When they catch them thus, they bring them on shore, and boil the fat of them as they do of whales, into train oil, and the like they do with several other great fish, which sometimes they find in the sea there. And sometimes they have grampuses, fin fish, and several species of the small whale kind which come up there, and which they always make the best of, if they can take them. One year in particular there came several such fish on shore, which they could find no name for. There was 8 or 9 of them, which I saw lying on the shore of Fife, from Kinghorn to the Easter Reams, some of which were 20 foot long and upward. But this sort of fishing is but by accident, and the profits not certain. The Firth affords a much more certain and profitable fishery lower down, of which in its place. The ferry, from Leith to the shore of Fife, is fixed in this town, though sometimes the boats in distress, and by force of wind and weather, are driven to run into Borant Island. This constant going and coming of the ferry boat, and passengers, is also a considerable benefit to the town of Kinghorn, and is a very great article in its commerce. East of this town is Kirkcaldy, a larger, more populous, and better built town than the other, and indeed than any on this coast. Its situation is in length, in one street running along the shore, from east to west, for a long mile, and very well built, the streets clean and well paved. There are some small by streets or lanes, and it has some considerable merchants in it, I mean in the true sense of the word merchant. There are also several good ships belonging to the town, also as Fife is a good corn country, here are some that deal very largely in corn, and export great quantities both to England and Holland. Here are great quantities of linen shipped off for England, and as these ships return freighted either from England or Holland, they bring all needful supplies of foreign goods. So that the traders in Kirkcaldy have really a very considerable traffic, both at home and abroad. There are several coal pits here, not only in the neighbourhood, but even close to the very sea, at the west end of the town, and where, one would think, the tide should make it impossible to work them. At the east end of the town is a convenient yard for building and repairing of ships, and farther east than that several salt pans for the boiling and making of salt. Kirkcaldy is a member of the royal boroughs, as are also Brunt Island, Kinghorn, and Dysart, though almost all of them together are not equal to this town, so that here are no less than 4 royal boroughs in the riding of 5 miles. Dysart is next, a town that gives the title of noble or baron to the Lord Dysart, who resides in England, though the property both of the town and the lands adjoining, belong to the Lord Sinclair or St. Clair, but be the estate whose it will, the town, though a royal burgh, is, as I said before of Dunfermline, in the full perfection of decay, and is, indeed, a most lamentable object of a miserable, dying corporation. The only support which, I think, preserves the name of a town to it, is, that here is, in the lands adjoining, an excellent vein of Scots coal, and the Lord Dysart, the landlord, has a good salt work in the town. Close to the sea there is a small pier or wharf for ships, to come and load both the salt and the coal, and this, I think, may be said to be the whole trade of the town, except some nailers and hardware workers, and they are but few. I take the decay of all these seaport towns, which 'tis evident have made a much better figure in former times, to be owing to the removing of the court and nobility of Scotland to England. For it is most certain, when the court was at home, they had a confluence of strangers, residents of foreign ministers, being of armies, and consequently the nobility dwelt at home, spent the income of their estates, and the product of their country among their neighbours. The return of their coal and salt, and corn and fish, brought them in goods from abroad and, perhaps, money. They sent their linen and other goods to England, and received the returns in money. They made their own manufactures, and though not so good and cheap as from England, yet they were cheaper to the public stock, because their own poor were employed. Their wool, which they had over and above, went to France, and returned ready money. Their lead went to Holland, and their cattle and sheep to England, and brought back in that one article above 100,000 L. sterling per ann. Then it was the seaport towns had a trade, their court was magnificent, their nobility built fine houses and palaces which were richly furnished, and nobly finished within and without. They had infinitely more value went out than came back in goods, and therefore the balance was evidently on their side, whereas, now their court is gone, their nobility and gentry spend their time, and consequently their estates in England. The Union opens the door to all English manufactures, and suppresses their own, prohibits their wool going abroad, and yet scarcely takes it off at home. If the cattle goes to England, the money is spent there too. The troops rice there are in English service, and Scotland receives no premia for the levies, as she might have done abroad, and as the Swiss and other nations do at this time. This I take to be the true state of the case. And as this is not foreign to the design of this work, I am the longer upon it. I gave a particular account in my description of Glasgow, Irwin, and Dumfries, to shew you how those places were enriched by the increase of their commerce, and how the commerce was increased by the union of the two kingdoms. I must likewise, in justice, demonstrate how and why these seaports, on the east coast, decline and decay by the same occasion, and from the same cause. It is true, Scotland would have an advantageous trade with England, and not the worst for the Union, were not the court removed, and did not their nobility dwell abroad, and spend their estates abroad. Scotland has a plentiful product for exportation, and were the issue of that product returned and consumed at home, Scotland would flourish and grow rich, but as it is, I may venture to say, it is not to be expected. For example, the product of Scotland, I say, is very considerable. I mean that part of it which is exported to foreign parts, for what is consumed at home is nothing, that is to say adds nothing to the public stock of the nation, speaking of Scotland as a nation by herself. All the product of Scotland which is sent abroad, and exported to foreign countries, and consumed there, is so much clear gain to the public stock, excepting only the cost of its manufacturing at home, or curing in sending out. And except so much as is brought back in goods of the growth, and manufacture of foreign countries, and is consumed in Scotland, which is not reckoned as gain, because consumed. If it is exported again, the article goes to the account of public gain again. Now to state the case briefly between the exportation and importation of goods in Scotland, that the difference, which is the balance of the trade, may appear. The product of Scotland, which it exports into foreign countries, England included, for I am now considering Scotland as if not united, is as follows. Corn. Black cattle. Sheep. Wool. Linen of several sorts. Some woolen manufactures, stockings in particular. All these carried to England and that in great quantities. Corn. Lead. Salt. Coal. Barrelled pork. Salmon. To Holland, Bremen, and Hambro. N.B. The Dutch buy the barrelled pork from Aberdeen for victualling their East India ships, it being much better cured than from any other country. Salt. Oatmeal. Salmon. Lead. Stockings. Linen. To Norway. Salt. Woolen manufactures of Stirling and Aberdeen. To Sweden, Danzig, and to Riga, and herrings pickled. Barreled and dried salmon. Herring and white fish. To Spain and the Straits. Coal. Salt. Lead. Herrings. White fish. Wool. To France. For all these exportations the returns are, or at least were before the Union. Pewter. Block tin. Wrought iron. Glassware. Sugars. Tobacco. Drugs and dyers' stuffs. From England. N.B. All the English woolen and silk manufactures were prohibited upon the several penalties, so that the returns from England, in goods, were very small. The grand return from thence was in specie, and 'tis known, that above £100,000 a year was paid into Scotland every year, for cattle only. Fine linens, not much. Because of their own. Lace and fine threads. Gimp, inkle, and East India goods. Linseed, and lint or flax. Linseed oil, train oil. And whalebone. From Holland. Pitch and tar. Deals and fir timber. From Norway. Iron in bars and copper. Deals and timber. From Sweden. Plank, called East Country clapboard, or wainscot. Oak timber, and in quarters. Hemp. Pitch. Tar. Turpentine. Sturgeon. Flax. From Danzig, Königsberg, Riga, Narva, and Petersburg. Wine brandy. Apples, rennets. Rosin. Cork. Paper. Wrought silks. Raw silk. Toys. Perfumes, and From France. Oil and Italian pickles from Leghorn. Way of the Royal Canal through France. Staves for casks. Clapboard. Rhenish wine. Old hock. From Hamburg. All these goods, indeed, come to Scotland, but then the quantities are very small. 'Tis evident, the chief articles are, to sum up all in a little. Sugar and tobacco. Wine and brandy. Naval stores. Swedes iron and copper. Deals and timber. Lint and linseed. From England. France. The East Country. Sweden. Norway. Holland. And all these put together, if I am rightly informed, do not balance the lead, coal, and salt, which they export every year, so that the balance of trade must stand greatly to the credit of the account in the Scots commerce. And what then, would not such an annual wealth in specie do for Scotland in a year, if there was not a gulf, into which it all runs as into a sink? I know this is abundantly answered, by saying that Scotland is now established in a lasting tranquillity, the wars between the nations are at an end, the wastings and plunderings, the ravages and blood are all over. The lands in Scotland will now be improved, their estates doubled, the charges of defending her abroad and at home lies upon England, the taxes are easy and ascertained, and the West India trade abundantly pours in wealth upon her. And this is all true. And, in the end, I am still of opinion Scotland will be gainer, but I must add, that her own nobility, would they be true patriots, should then put their helping hand to the rising advantages of their own country. And spend some of the large sums they get in England in applying to the improvement of their country, erecting manufactures, employing the poor, and propagating the trade at home. Which they may see plainly has made their united neighbours of England so rich. Why might not the wool, which they send to England, be manufactured in Scotland? If they say they know not how to make the goods, or how to dispose of them when made, my answer is short. I know 'tis not the work of gentlemen to turn manufacturers and merchants, and I know also a number of projectors, that is to say, thieves and cheats, have teased and hanged about them, to draw them into manufacturing. Only to bubble them of their wool and money. But here is a plain scheme, let the Scots gentlemen set but their stewards to work to employ the poor people to spin the wool into yarn, and send the yarn into England. 'Tis an easy manufacture, and what the Scots are very handy at, and this could never be difficult. They may have patterns of the yarn given them here, a price agreed on, and good security for payment, this can have no difficulty. The Irish are fallen into this way, to such a degree, that 40,000 packs of wool and worsted yarn are brought into England now every year, and sold here, where, about 30 years ago, not a pound of it was imported ready spun. This, and many such advantages in trade, Scotland might find in her own bounds, her gentlemen assisting the poor only with their stocks of wool. By which means the poverty and sloth of the meaner people would be removed, and Scotland enriched, but I have done my part, and have not room to enlarge. Nature will dictate enough to the gentlemen to go to work upon it, if they have any design to do their country good, and if a narrow and selfish spirit does not continue to prevail among them. The decayed burghs being passed, we came to a village called the Weems, or by way of distinction, the Wester Weems, or Wames. This is a small town, and no borough, belonging to the Earl of Wemyss, whose house stands a little farther east, on the top of a high cliff, looking down upon the sea, as Dover Castle looks down upon the strait, between it and Calais. Though not so high. The account given lately of this noble castle of the Wemyss is very romantic, and must necessarily be laughed at by the family itself who know the house. It is a very good house, and has one large front to the sea, but without any Windsor-like terrace between the house and it, as is represented. At the west end, upon the same cliff, is a small plain, where had been a bowling green, and where the late Earl, being admiral, had some small field pieces planted to answer salutes. Behind the house is a small and irregular courtyard, with two wings of building, being offices to the house on one side, and stables on the other. Nor is there any gardens, or room for any, much less a spacious park, on the north side of the house. But the road from the Wester Wemyss to the Easter passing between, there is a large, well-planted orchard, and it is no other, nor otherwise intended, and as to a spacious park, there is nothing like it. There is a piece of waste ground planted with fir trees, at the east end of the house, but they do not thrive, nor would any man call it a park, especially for a nobleman too, that had seen what a park means in England. But, indeed, in Scotland they call all enclosed grounds parks, whether for grass or corn, and so they call all gardens yards, as St. Anne's yards, at the palace of Holyrood House, and the like in other places. From hence you pass through the East Wemyss to another village, called Buckhaven, inhabited chiefly, if not only, by fishermen, whose business is wholly to catch fresh fish every day in the Firth, and carry them to Leith and Edinburgh markets. And though this town be a miserable row of cottage-like buildings, and people altogether mere fishermen, as I have said, yet there is scarce a poor man in the town, and in general the town is rich. Here we saw the shore of the sea covered with shrimps, like the ground covered with a thin snow, and as you rode among them they would rise like a kind of dust, being scarred by the footing of the horse, and hopping like grasshoppers. The fishermen of this town have a great many boats of all sorts and sizes, and some larger, which lie upon the beach unrigged, which every year they fit out for the herring season, in which they have a very great share. Beyond this is the Methule, a little town, but a very safe and good harbour, firmly built of stone, almost like the Cobb at Lyme, though not wholly projecting into the sea, but standing within the land, and built out with two heads and walls of thick strong stone. It stands a little on the west side of the mouth of the river Leven. The salmon of this river are esteemed the best in this part of Scotland. Here my Lord Wemyss brings his coal, which he digs above 2 miles off, on the banks of the river Leven, and here it is sold or shipped off. As also what salt he can make, which is not a great deal. Nor is the estate his lordship makes from the said coal works equal to what it has been, the water having, after an immense charge to throw it off, broken in upon the works, and hindered their going on, at least to any considerable advantage. The people who work in the coal mines in this country, what with the dejected countenances of the men, occasioned by their poverty and hard labour, and what with the colour or discolouring, which comes from the coal, both to their clothes and complexions, are well described by their own countryman Samuel Colville, in his famous macaronic poem, called Polemo Midinia. Thus: Colhures nigri, Gernantes mordevelli. Paul mid. They are, indeed, frightful fellows at first sight, but I return to my progress from the Methule. We have several small towns on the coast, as Creel or Crail, Pittenween, Anstruther, or Anster, as 'tis usually called. These are all royal burghs, and send members to Parliament, even still upon the new establishment. In consequence only that now they join 3 or 4 towns together to choose 1 or 2 members, whereas they chose every town for itself. Over against this shore, and in the mouth of the Forth, opposite to the Isle of the Bass, lies the Isle of May, known to mariners by having a lighthouse upon it, the only constant inhabitant. Is said to be the man maintained there by the government, to take care of the fire in the lighthouse. Here, you may observe, the French fleet lay with some assurance, when the Pretender was on board, and here the English 4 o'clock gun, on board their approaching squadron, unhappily gave them the alarm. So that they immediately got under sail, and made the best of their way, the English pursuing them in vain, except only that they took the Salisbury, which was a considerable way behind the fleet, and could not come up with the rest. The story is well known, so I need not repeat it. The shore of the Firth or Frith ends here, and the estuarium or mouth opening, the land of Fife falls off to the north, making a promontory of land, which the seamen call Fifeness, looking east to the German Ocean. After which the coast trends away north, and the first town we saw there was St. Andrews, an antient city, the seat of an archbishop, and an university. As you must expect a great deal of antiquity in this country of Fife, so you must expect to find all those antient pieces mourning their own decay, and drooping and sinking in ashes. Here it was, that old limb of St. Lucifer, Cardinal Beaton, massacred and murdered that famous sufferer and martyr of the Scots Church, Mr. William Wishart, whom he caused to be burnt in the parade of the castle, he himself sitting in his balcony to feed and glut his eyes with the sight of it. The old church here was a noble structure. It was longer than St. Paul's in London, by a considerable deal, I think, by 6 yards, or by 25 foot. This building is now sunk into a simple parish church, though there are many plain discoveries of what it has been, and a great deal of project and fancy may be employed to find out the antient shape of it. The city is not large, nor is it contemptibly small. There are some very good buildings in it, and the remains of many more. The colleges are handsome buildings, and well supplied with men of learning in all sciences, and who govern the youth they instruct with reputation. The students wear gowns here of a scarlet-like color, but not in grain, and are very numerous. The university is very ancient as well as the city. The foundation was settled, and the public buildings appointed in the beginning of the 15th century by King James I. 'Tis true, they tell us here were private schools set up many ages before that, even as far back as 937. But I see no evidence of the fact, and so do not propose it for your belief, though 'tis very likely there was some beginnings made before the king came to encourage them, so far as to form an university. There are 3 colleges in all. The most antient, and which, they say, was the public school so long before, is called St. Salvador. How it was made to speak Portuguese, I know not, unless it might be that some Portuguese clergymen came over hither as the first professors or teachers. In English it is St. Saviour's, in Spanish it would be called Nostra Señora, or Our Lord. And so St. Mary's would be called Nostra Dame de St. Andrew, or Our Lady of St. Andrews. This college of St. Mary's is called the New College, and the middlemost, for age, is called St. Leonard's College. The old college, as I have said, though it was a school, as they affirm, above 200 years before, was turned into a college, or founded as such by James Kennedy, the son of the Lord Kennedy by Mary, daughter of King Robert III. This James Kennedy was a clergyman of great fame in those days, and rose by the reputation of his wisdom, prudence, and beneficence to all mankind, to the highest posts of honour in the state and dignity in the church. For he was Lord Chancellor of Scotland under James II. And Archbishop of this see of St. Andrews. He was a great lover of learning, and of learned men. And was the first who encouraged men of learning from abroad, to come there and take upon them the governing and instructing the youth in the great school, which, as I say above, had been there so long, as that it was then called the Antient School of St. Andrew. These learned men put him upon founding and endowing a college, or rather turning the school into a college or academy, which he did. The building is antient, but appears to have been very magnificent considering the times it was erected in, which was 1456. The gate is large, and has a handsome spire over it all of stone. In the first court, on the right side as you go in, is the chapel of the college, not extraordinary large, but sufficient. There is an antient monument of the Archbishop the founder, who lies buried in the church of his own building. Beyond the chapel is the cloister, after the antient manner, not unlike that in Canterbury, but not so large. Opposite to this are offices, and proper buildings for the necessary use of the colleges. In the second court are the schools of the college, on the same spot where stood the antient grammar school, mentioned above, if that part is to be depended upon. Over these schools is a very large hall for the public exercises, as is usual in other universities, but this is a most spacious building, and far larger than there is any occasion for. In the same court are the apartments for the masters, professors, and regents, which, as our fellows, are in salary, and are tutors and governors to the several students. Were this college supported by additional bounties and donations, as has been the case in England, and were sufficient funds appointed to repair and keep up the buildings, there would few colleges in England go beyond it for magnificence, but want of this, and other encouragements, causes the whole building to seem as if it was in its declining state, and looking into its grave. The truth is, the college wants nothing but a good fund to be honestly applied for the repair of the building, finishing the first design, and encouraging the scholars. Dr. Skene, principal of this college, shewed the way to posterity to do this, and laid out great sums in repairs, especially of the churches, and founded a library for the use of the house. They tell you a story here of 9 maces found under the Archbishop's tomb, after the restoration of King Charles II. But to me the story does not tell well at all. First, it does not appear of what use, or to what purpose so many maces were made and kept there, the like not being known to be used in any cathedral or college in other countries, and in the next place how came they to rummage the good founder's grave, and that in King Charles the Ides time too. If it had been in Oliver Cromwell's domination, it would have seemed rational to expect it, but after the restoration to ravage the monuments of the dead, is something extraordinary, but be that as it will, there are 3 maces kept in the college. Whether they were found in the king's tomb or not, that I leave to tradition, as I find it. One of these maces is of very fine workmanship, all of silver, gilt, and very heavy, of fine imagery, and curious workmanship, made at Paris by the Archbishop's special directions, as appears by an inscription on a plate, fastened to the mace by a little chain, and preserved with it. The story of St. Andrew and of his bones being buried here, of the first stone of the cathedral church being laid upon one of St. Andrew's legs or thigh bone, and of those bones being brought from Patras in the Morea, near the Gulf of Lepanto. These things are too antient, and sound too much of the legend for me to meddle with. In the second college, which is called St. Leonard's, is a principal, who must be a doctor of divinity by the foundation. But the present church government insisting upon the parity of the clergy, are pleased to dispense with that part. There are also 4 professors of philosophy, to whom the late Sir John Scott, a bountiful benefactor to this college, has added a professor of philology, and has settled a very handsome stipend upon the professor. Also the same gentleman augmented the college library with several valuable books to a very considerable sum. And since that Sir John Wedderburn, a gentleman of a very antient family, and a great lover of learning, has given a whole library, being a great and choice collection of books, to be added to the library of this college. The revenue of this college is larger than that of the old college, it has also more students. It was founded and endowed by the Earl of Lennox, being before that a religious house, of the order of St. Benedict, as appears by the register and charter of the foundation. It is not so large and magnificent as Street Salvador originally was, but 'tis kept in much better repair. It has but 1 court or square, but it is very large. The old building of the monastery remains entire, and makes the south side, and the old cells of the monks make now the chambers for the students, the chapel takes up the north side, and a large side of more modern apartments on the west, which are nevertheless old enough to be falling down. But they are now repairing them, and adding a great pile of building to complete the square, and join that side to the north where the chapel stands. This college has large yards, as they call them, that is to say gardens, or rather orchards, well planted, and good walks in them as well as good fruit. This college has many benefactors, which makes it flourish much beyond the first. And they talk of a large gift yet to come from a noble family, which, if it falls, will enable them to put the whole house in complete repair. The new college, called St. Mary's, was founded by Cardinal Beaton, Archbishop of St. Andrews, and is very singular in its reserved and limited laws. Here are no scholars at all. But all those scholars who have passed their first studies, and gone through a course of philosophy in any of the other colleges, may enter themselves here to study Hebrew and the mathematics, history, or other parts of science. It was in this college King Charles I held a parliament. The place is called the Parliament Room to this day, and is a very large, spacious room able to receive 400 people, plaqued on seats to sit down. The form is reserved very plain, and the place, where the tables for the clerks and other officers were set, is to be seen. There is a library also to this college, but not very valuable, or so well furnished as that of St. Leonard's. Here are, however, 2 professors of divinity, one is called the principal professor of theology, and the other barely the professor of theology. To these was afterwards added a professor of the mathematics. And he that was the first who enjoyed the place, viz. Dr. Gregory, obtained an observatory to be erected, and gave them abundance of mathematical and astronomical instruments, but it is not now made use of, for what reason I know not. In the new church in this city lies the body of the late Archbishop Sharp, who was assassinated upon a moor or heath, as he was coming in his coach home to this city from the court. There is a fine monument of marble over his grave, with his statue kneeling on the upper part, and the manner of his murder is cut in bas relief below. This murder is matter of history, but is so foolishly, or so partially, or so imperfectly related by all that have yet written of it, that posterity will lose both the fact and the cause of it in a few years more. It would require too large a space in this work to give a fresh and impartial account of it, and for that reason I cannot enter upon it, though I have the most exact account that, I believe, is left in the world. Which I had from the mouth of one of the actors, and have since had it confirmed from several others, thoroughly acquainted with the particulars of it. I shall only say here, that the Archbishop had been a furious and merciless persecutor, and, indeed, murderer of many of the innocent people, merely for their keeping up their field meetings, and was charged in particular with 2 actions. Which, if true will, though not justify, yet take off much of the black part, which the very murder itself leaves on the memory of the actors. The keeping back the reprieve, which was sent down by King Charles Ides express order, and which was actually received for stopping the execution of 12 persons, under sentence of death. I say keeping it back in his pocket till they were executed. I know Bishop Burnet charges this upon another hand, but these men were assured the Archbishop was the man, perhaps, the other might be consenting. The shipping 200 poor men on board a vessel, on pretence of transportation to the English colonies in the West Indies, but ordering the ship to be run on shore and lost. I say it is said to be ordered, and generally so believed, because, when the ship was bulged upon the rocks, the master and seamen, and the officers, appointed to confine the banished people, all got on shore, but locked all the rest down under the hatches, and would not suffer one of them to come out, by which means they every one perished. These 2 things they charged directly on the Archbishop, besides many other cruelties, which they called murders, and if they were acted, as is related by others as well as they, I must acknowledge they could be no other. Now 'tis as certain that these men knew nothing of meeting with the Archbishop at that time. But being themselves outlawed men, whom any man that met might kill, and who, if taken, would have been put to death, they always went armed, and were, at that time, looking for another man. When unexpectedly they saw the bishop coming towards them in his coach, when one of them says to the other, "We have not found the person we looked for. But lo, God has delivered our enemy, and the murderer of our brethren into our hands, against whom we cannot obtain justice by the law, which is perverted, but remember the words of the text, if ye let him go, thy life shall be required for his life. In a word, they immediately resolved to fall upon him, and cut him in pieces. I say they resolved, all but one, viz. Haxton of Rathlet, who was not willing to have his hand in the blood, though he acknowledged he deserved to die, so that when they attacked the bishop, Haxton went off, and stood at a distance, nor did he hold their horses, as one has ignorantly published. For they attacked him all mounted, nor could they well have stopped a coach and 6 horses, if they had been on foot. I mention this part, because, however Providence ordered it, so it was, that none of the murderers ever fell into the hands of justice, but this Haxton of Rathlet, who was most cruelly tortured, and afterwards had his hands cut off, and was then executed at Edinburgh. I have not time to give the rest of this story, though the particulars are very well worth relating, but it is remote from my purpose, and I must proceed. The city of St. Andrews is, notwithstanding its many disasters, such as the ruin of the great church, the demolishing its castle, and the Archbishop's palace, and Oliver Cromwell's citadel. Yet, I say, it is still a handsome city, and well built, the streets straight and large, being 3 streets parallel to one another, all opening to the sea. They shew among other remains of antiquity the apartments of the palace where Cardinal Beaton stood, or sat in state to see the martyrdom of Mr. Wishart, who, at the stake, called aloud to him, and cited him to appear at the bar of God's justice within such a certain time, within which time he was murdered by the famous Norman Leslie, thrown into the square of the court, and his body dragged to the very spot where the good man was burned at the stake, and also they shew us the window where they threw him out, which particular part of the building seems to have been sparred, as if on purpose to commemorate the fact, of which, no doubt, divine justice had the principal direction. The truth is, Cardinal Beaton was another Sharp, N.A.B. Sharp was a second Beaton, alike persecutors for religion, alike merciless in their prosperity, and alike miserable in their fall, for they were both murdered, or killed by assassination. From St. Andrews we came to Cooper, the shire town, as it would be called in England, where the public business of the country is all done. Here are 2 very agreeable seats belonging to the present Earl of Leven. One is called Melville, and the other Balgony. Melville is a regular and beautiful building, after the model of Sir William Bruce's house at Kinross, described before. Balgony is an antient seat, formerly belonged to the family of Leslie, and if not built, was enlarged and repaired by the great General Leslie, who was so famed in Germany, serving under the glorious king of soldiers Gustavus Adolphus. The river Leven runs just under the walls, as I may say, of the house, and makes the situation very pleasant. The park is large, but not well planted, nor do the avenues that are planted thrive, for the very reason which I have mentioned already. From hence we went north to Cooper above Namd, and where, as I said, the sheriff keeps his court. The Earl of Rothes is hereditary sheriff of the Shire of Fife, and the Duke of Atholl was Chancellor of the University of St. Andrews, in the times of the episcopal government, but that dignity seems now to be laid aside. We now went away to the northeast part of the county, to see the ruins of the famous monastery of Balmerinoch, of which Mr. Camden takes notice. But we saw nothing worth our trouble, the very ruins being almost eaten up by time. The Lord Balmerinoch, of the family of Elphingston, takes his title from the place, the land being also in his possession. The monastery was founded by Queen Ermengerd, wife of King William of Scotland. Hence we came to the bank of another firth or frith, called the Firth of Tay, which, opening to a large breadth at its entrance, as the Firth of Edinburgh does, draws in afterwards as that does at the Queen's Ferry, and makes a ferry over at the breadth of 2 miles to the town of Dundee. And then the Firth widening again just as that of the Forth does also, continues its breadth as 4 to 6 miles, till it comes almost to Perth, as the other does to Stirling. This river Tay is, without exception, the greatest river in Scotland, and of the longest course, for it rises out of the mountains, on the edge of Argyll Shire, and running first north into the Shire of Breadalbane, there receiving many other rivers, it spreads itself into a large lake, which is called Loch Tay, extending for 40 miles in length, and traversing the very heart of Scotland. Comes into the sea near this place. Now, as I design to keep in this part of my work to the east coast of the country, I must for the present quit the Tay itself, keeping a little on the hither side of it, and go back to that part of the country which lies to the south, and yet east of Dunbarton and Lennox shires. So drawing an imaginary line from Stirling Bridge, due north, through the heart of the country to Inverness, which I take to lie almost due north and south. In this course then I moved from the ferry, mentioned above, to Perth, lying upon the same river Tay, but on the hither bank. It was formerly called St. Johnston, or St. John's Town, from an old church, dedicated to the evangelist, St. John, part of which is still remaining, and is yet big enough to make 2 parochial churches, and serve the whole town for their public worship. The chief business of this town is the linen manufacture. And it is so considerable here, all the neighbouring country being employed in it, that it is a wealth to the whole place. The Tay is navigable up to the town for ships of good burthen. And they ship off here so great a quantity of linen, all for England, that all the rest of Scotland is said not to ship off so much more. This town was unhappily for some time, the seat of the late rebellion. But I cannot say it was unhappy for the town, for the townsmen got so much money by both parties, that they are evidently enriched by it. And it appears not only by the particular families and persons in the town, but by their public and private buildings which they have raised since that, as particularly a new Tolbooth or town hall. The salmon taken here, and all over the Tay, is extremely good, and the quantity prodigious. They carry it to Edinburgh, and to all the towns where they have no salmon, and they barrel up a great quantity for exportation. The merchants of this town have also a considerable trade to the Baltic, to Norway, and especially, since as above, they were enriched by the late rebellion. It seems a little enigmatic to us in the south, how a rebellion should enrich any place, but a few words will explain it. First, I must premise, that the Pretender and his troops lay near, or in this place a considerable time. Now the bare consumption of victuals and drink, is a very considerable advantage in Scotland, and therefore 'tis frequent in Scotland for towns to petition the government to have regiments of soldiers quartered upon them. Which in England would look monstrous, nothing being more terrible and uneasy to our towns in England. Again, as the Pretender and his troops lay in the neighbourhood, namely at Scone, so a very great confluence of the nobility, clergy, and gentry, however fatally, as to themselves, gathered about him, and appeared here also, making their court to him in person, and waiting the issue of his fortunes, till they found the storm gathering from the south, and no probable means to resist it, all relief from abroad being everywhere disappointed. And then they shifted off as they could. While they resided here, their expense of money was exceeding great, lodgings in the town of Perth let for such a rate, as was never known in the place before. Trade was in a kind of a hurry, provision dear, in a word, the people, not of the town only, but of all the country round, were enriched, and had it lasted 2 or 3 months longer, it would have made all the towns rich. When this cloud was dispersed, and all the party fled and gone, the victors entered, the general officers and the loyal gentlemen succeeded the abdicated and routed party. But here was still the headquarters, and afterwards the Dutch troops continued here most part of the winter, all this while the money flowed in, and the town made their market on both sides. For they gained, by the royal armies being on that side of the country, and by the foreigners being quartered there, almost as much, though not in so little time as by the other. The town was well built before, but now has almost a new face. For as I said, here are abundance of new houses, and more of old houses new fitted and repaired, which look like new. The linen trade too, which is their main business, has mightily increased since the late Act of Parliament in England, for the suppressing the use and wearing of printed calicoes. So that the manufacture is greatly increased here, especially of that kind of cloth which they buy here and send to England to be printed, and which is so much used in England in the room of the calicoes, that the worsted and silk weavers in London seem to have very little benefit by the bill, but that the linen of Scotland and Ireland are, as it were, constituted in the room of the calicoes. From Perth I went south to that part of the province of Fife, which they call Clackmannan, lying west from Dunfermline, and extending itself towards Stirling and Dumlane, all which part one had not gone over before, and which was anciently accounted to be part of Fife. From Perth to Stirling there lies a vale which they call Strathmore, and which is a fine level country, though surrounded with hills, and is esteemed the most fruitful in corn of all that part of the country. It lies extended on both sides the Tay, and is said to reach to Brehin north-east, and almost to Stirling south-west. Here are, as in all such pleasant soils you will find, a great many gentlemen's seats, though on the north side of the Tay, and here in particular is the noble palace of Glamis, the hereditary seat of the family of Lyon, Earls of Strathmore. And as the heir in reversion now enjoys the title and estate, so it very narrowly escaped being forfeited. For the Eyder brother, Earl of Strathmore, having entertained the Pretender magnificently in this fine palace, and joined his forces in person, and with all his interest, lost his life in that service, being killed at the battle of Sheriffmuir. By his fall, the estate being entailed, descended to the second son, or younger brother, who is now Earl of Strathmore. Glamis is, indeed, one of the finest old-built palaces in Scotland, and by far the largest. And this makes me speak of it here, because I am naming the Pretender and his affairs, though a little out of place. When you see it at a distance it is so full of turrets and lofty buildings, spires and towers, some plain, others shining with gilded tops, that it looks not like a town, but a city. And the noble appearance seen through the long vistas of the park are so differing, that it does not appear like the same place any two ways together. The great avenue is a full half-mile, planted on either side with several rows of trees. When you come to the outer gate you are surprised with the beauty and the variety of the statues, busts, some of stone, some of brass, some gilded, some plain. The statues in brass are four, one of King James VI, one of King Charles I, booted and spurred, as if going to take horse at the head of his army, one of Charles II. Habited La Hero, which the world knows he had nothing of about him, and one of King James VIL after the pattern of that at Whitehall. When the Pretender Lodg'd here, for the Earl of Strathmore entertained him in his first passage to Perth with great magnificence, there were told 43 furnished rooms on the first floor of the house. Some beds, perhaps, were put up for the occasion, for they made 80 beds for them, and the whole retinue of the Pretender was received, the house being able to receive the court of a real reigning prince. It would be endless to go about to describe the magnificent furniture, the family pictures, the gallery, the fine collection of original paintings, and the nobly painted ceilings of the chapel, where is an organ for the service after the manner of the Church of England. In a word, the house is as nobly furnished as most palaces in Scotland, but, as I said, it was at the brink of destruction, for had the Earl not been killed, 'tis odds but it had been gutted by the army, which presently spread all the country. But it was enough, the Earl lost his life, and the present Earl enjoys it peaceably. From hence I came away south-west, and crossing the Tay below Perth, but above Dundee, came to Dumlane, a name made famous by the late battle fought between the army of King George, under the command of the Duke of Argyll, and the Pretender's forces under the Earl of Mar, which was fought on Sheriffmuir, between Stirling and Dumlane. The town is pleasantly situated, and tolerably well built, but out of all manner of trade, so that there is neither present prosperity upon it, or prospect of future. Going from hence we took a full view of the field of battle, called Sheriffmuir, and had time to contemplate how it was possible, that a rabble of Highlanders armed in haste, appearing in rebellion, and headed by a person never in arms before, nor of the least experience, should come so near to the overthrowing an army of regular, disciplined troops, and led on by experienced officers, and so great a general. But when the mistake appeared also, we blessed the good protector of Great Britain, who, under a piece of the most mistaken conduct in the world, to say no worse of it, gave that important victory to King George's troops, and prevented the ruin of Scotland from an army of Highlanders. From this place of reflection I came forward in sight of Stirling Bridge, but leaving it on the right hand, turned away east to Alloway, where the Earl of Mar has a noble seat, I should have said had a noble seat. and where the navigation of the Firth of Forth begins. This is, as I hinted before, within 4 miles of Stirling by land, and scarcely within 20 by water, occasioned by those uncommon meanders and reaches in the river, which gives so beautiful a prospect from the castle of Stirling. This fine seat was formerly called the Castle of Alloway, but is now so beautified, the buildings, and especially the gardens, so complete and completely modern, that no appearance of a castle can be said to remain. There is a harbour for shipping, and ships of burthen may come safely up to it, and this is the place where the Glasgow merchants are, as I am told, erecting magazines or warehouses, to which they propose to bring their tobacco and sugars by land, and then to ship them for Holland or Hamburg, or the Baltic, or England, as they find opportunity, or a market. And I doubt not but they will find their advantage in it. The gardens of Alloway House, indeed, well deserve a description. They are, by much, the finest in Scotland, and not outdone by many in England. The gardens, singly described, take up above 40 acres of ground, and the adjoining wood, which is adapted to the house in avenues and vistas, above 3 times as much. It would be lessening the place to attempt the description, unless I had room to do it completely. 'Tis enough to say it requires a book, not a page or 2, there is, in a word, everything that nature and art can do, brought to perfection. The town is pleasant, well built, and full of trade, for the whole country has some business or other with them, and they have a better navigation than most of the towns on the Firth, for a ship of 300 ton may lie also at the very wharf. So that at Alloway a merchant may trade to all parts of the world, as well as at Leith or at Glasgow. The High Street of Alloway reaches down to this harbour, and is a very spacious, well-built street, with rows of trees finely planted all the way. Here are several testimonies of the goodness of their trade, as particularly a large deal yard, or place for laying up all sorts of Norway goods, which shews they have a commerce thither. They have large warehouses of naval stores, such as pitch, tar, hemp, flax, 2 saw-mealies for cutting or slitting of deals, and a rope walk for making all sorts of ropes and cables for rigging and fitting of ships, with several other things, which convinces us they are no strangers to other trades, as well by sea as by land. It is a strange testimony of the power of envy and ambition, that mankind, blessed with such advantages, for an easy and happy retreat in the world, should hazard it all in faction and party, and throw it all away in view. And even without a view of getting more, but I must not philosophize, any more than launch out into other excesses. My business is with the present state of the place, and to that I confine myself as near as I can. From Alloway, east, the country is called the Shire of Clackmannan, and is known for yielding the best of coal, and the greatest quantity of it of any country in Scotland. So that it is carried, not to Edinburgh only, but to England, to Holland, and to France, and they tell us of new pits, or mines of coal now discovered, which will yield such quantities, and too easy to come at, as are never to be exhausted. Though such great quantities should be sent to England, as the York Buildings Company boast of, namely, 20,000 ton a year. Which, however, I take it as it is, for a boast, or rather a pretence to persuade the world they have a demand for such a quantity. Whereas, while the freight from Scotland is, as we know, so dear, and the tax in England continues so heavy, the price of these coals will always be so high at London, as will not fail to restrain the consumption. Nor is it the interest of Scotland to send away so great a quantity of coal as shall either make a scarcity, or raise the price of them at home. On this shore of the Firth, farther down, stands the town of Culross, a neat and agreeable town, lying in length by the water side, like Kirkcaldy, and being likewise a trading town, as trade must be understood in Scotland. Here is a pretty market, a plentiful country behind it, and the navigable Firth before it, the coal and the linen manufacture, and plenty of corn. Such exportations will always keep something of trade alive upon this whole coast. Here is a very noble seat belonging to the Bruces, Earls of Kincairn, and is worth description. But that I have known so many fine houses, and have yet so many to go over before I go through the whole tour of Scotland, that it is impossible to give every fine house a place here, nor would it do any thing but tire the reader, rather than inform him. As I have done therefore in England, I must be content to name them, unless I should make my journey a mere visit to great houses, as if Scotland had nothing else worth notice. This calling at Culross, called vulgarly Couries, finishes my observations upon the province of Fife. They told me of mines of copper, and of lead, lately discovered in Fife, and of silver also, but I could not learn that any of them were actually wrought, or, as they call it in Derbyshire, at work. It is, however, not improbable, but that there are such mines, the country seeming very likely for it by many particular tokens. The two Lomans in this province are two remarkable mountains, which particularly seem to promise metal in their bowels, if they were thoroughly searched. They rise up like two sugar loaves in the middle of a plain country, not far from Falkland, and give a view of the Firth of Edinburgh south, and the Firth of Tay north, and are seen from Edinburgh very plain. Having made this little excursion to the south from Perth, you may suppose me now return northward again. And having give you my account of Perth, and its present circumstances, I now proceed that way, taking things as well in their ordinary situation as I can. We could not be at Perth and not have a desire to see that antient seat of royal ceremony, for the Scots kings, I mean of Scone, where all the kings of Scotland were crowned. Scone lies on the other side of the Tay, about a mile northwest from Perth. It was famous for the old chair in which the kings of Scotland were crowned, and which Edward I, King of England, having pierced through the whole kingdom, and nothing being able to withstand him, brought away with him. It is now deposited in Westminster, and the kings of Scotland are still crowned in it, according to an old Scots prophecy, which they say, mark it, I do but tell you they say so, was cut in the stone, which is enclosed in the lower part of the wooden chair in which the kings are crowned. Ni fallat fadem, scoti quocunque locatum. Invenient lapidem, regner tenenter ibidem. English thus. Or fate's deceived, and heaven decrees in vain. Or where this stone is found, the Scots shall reign. This palace was in those days a great monastery, and famous on occasion of this stone in the chair. The monks appropriating to themselves not the custom only, but the right of having all the kings crowned on it, as if it had been a sacred right and instituted in heaven, and that the kings would not prosper if they were crowned anywhere else. Process of time raised it from a monastery to a royal palace, in honor of the ceremony, and of King Kenneth, who, having fought a bloody battle there with the Picts, and given them a great overthrow, sat down to rest him upon this stone. After he had been tiered with the slaughter of the enemy, upon which his nobles came round about him to congratulate his success, and, in honor to his valor, crowned him with a garland of victory. After which he dedicated the stone to the ceremony, and appointed, that all the kings of Scotland should be crowned sitting upon it as he had done, and that then they should be victorious over all their enemies. But enough of fable, for this, I suppose, to be no other. Yet, be it how it will, this is no fable, that here all the kings of Scotland were crowned, and all the kings of Great Britain have been since crowned on it, or in the chair, or near it ever since. The palace of Scone, though antient, is not so much decayed as those I have already spoken of. And the Pretender found it very well in repair for his use. Here he lived and kept his court, a fatal court to the nobility and gentry of Scotland, who were deluded to appear for him. Here I say, he kept his court in all the state and appearance of a sovereign, and received honours as such. So that he might say he reigned in Scotland, though not over Scotland, for a few days, but it was but a few, about 20, till he and all his adherents were obliged to quit, not the place only, but the island, and that without fighting. Though the royal army was not above 10,000 men. The building is very large, the front above 200 foot in breadth, and has two extraordinary fine square courts, besides others, which contain the offices, outhouses, and the royal apartments are spacious and large, but the building, the wainscoting, the chimney pieces, and all after the old fashion. Among the pictures there, the Pretender had the satisfaction to see his mother's picture, an original, done in Italy, when she was Princess of Modena only, and was married by proxy, in the name of King James VII. Then Duke of York, represented by the Earl of Peterborough. Here is the longest gallery in Scotland, and the ceiling painted, but the painting exceeding old. From Scone to Dunkle is so little a way we desert to see it, being the place where the first skirmish was fought between the forces of King William, after the Revolution, and the Laird of Claverhouse, after called Viscount Dundee. And where the brave Lieutenant Colonel Cleland was killed, but Dundee's men, though 5,000, were gallantly repulsed by a handful even of new riced men. The Duke of Atholl has an old house here, and it was in one of the courts of that house that part of the action was, and the gentleman above named was shot from out of a window, as he was ordering and encouraging his men. We were almost tempted to go on this way, to see the field of battle, between the same Dundee and the great Lieutenant General Mackay, wherein the latter, though with regular troops, was really defeated by the Highlanders, but Dundee being killed by an accidental shot after the fight, they could not improve the victory, and the resistance ended soon after. Whereas, indeed, had not that accident happened, Dundee, who was a bold enterprising man, had certainly marched southward, and bid fair to have given King William a journey into the north, instead of a voyage to Ireland. But Providence had better things in store for Great Britain. But our determined route lay up the eastern shore, and through the shires, adjacent on that side, as particularly Angus, Mearns, Mar, Aberdeen, Buchan or Buckwin, and so as I laid it out before to Inverness. Mr. Camden tells us, that the Firth of Tay was the utmost bounds of the Roman Empire in Britain. That Julius Agricola, the best of generals under the worst of emperors, Domitian, though he peered farther, and traversed by land into the heart of the Highlands, yet seeing no end of the barbarous country, and no advantage by the conquest of a few barbarian mountaineers, withdrew and fixed the Roman eagles here. And that he frequently harassed the Picts by excursions and inroads, and destroyed the country, laying it waste, to starve them out of the fertilest part of it, but always returned to his post, making the Tay his frontier. But our English Caesars have outgone the Romans, for Edward I, as is said, passed the Tay, for he rifled the abbey at Scone. And, if we may believe history, penetrated into the remotest parts, which, however, I take to be only the remotest parts of what was then known to the English. For as to the Highlands, the mountains of Lochaber, Ross, Murray, Sutherland, and Caithness, we read nothing of them, and from these retreats the Scots always returned, Antæus-like, with double strength after every defeat, till in the next reign they overthrew his successor Edward II. At Bannockbourne, and drove the English out of the whole country, nay, and followed them over Tweed into England, ravaging the countries of Northumberland and Cumberland, and paying them in their own kind of interest. Oliver Cromwell, indeed, according to the motto of a noble house in Scotland, viz. Ride through, rode through. He penetrated to the remotest part of the island, and that he might rule them with a rod of iron in the very letter of it, he built citadels and forts in all the angles and extremes, where he found it needful to place his stationary legions. Just as the Romans did. As at Leith, at St. Andrews, at Inverness, Irwin, Innerlecky, and several other places, and just now we find King George's forces marching to the remotest corners, nay, ferrying over into the western, and northwestern islands. But then this is not as a foreigner and conqueror, but as a sovereign, a lawful governor and father of the country, to deliver from, not entangle her in the chains of tyranny and usurpation. But where armies have marched, private travellers may certainly pass, and with that assurance we cheerfully pass the Tay, trusting very much to that natural, known civility, which the Scots, in the remotest parts, always shew to strangers. Dundee, Aberdeen and the Highlands. We left Strathern therefore, with the little country of Menteith, for our return, and went down into Angus, on the northern banks of Tay to Dundee, a pleasant, large, populous city. And well deserves the title of Bonnie Dundee, so often given it in discourse, as well as in song, Bonnie, in Scots, signifying beautiful. As it stands well for trade, so it is one of the best trading towns in Scotland, and that as well as foreign business as in manufacture and home trade. It has but an indifferent harbour, but the Tay is a large, safe, and good road, and there is deep water and very good anchor-hold almost all over it. It is exceedingly populous, full of stately houses, and large handsome streets. Particularly it has 4 very good streets, with a large marketplace in the middle, the largest and fairest in Scotland, except only that of Aberdeen. The Tolbooth, or town hall, is an old, but large and convenient building. The inhabitants here appear like gentlemen, as well as men of business, and yet are real merchants too, and make good what we see so eminently in England, that true-bred merchants are the best of gentlemen. They have a very good and large correspondence here with England, and ship off a great deal of linen thither, also a great quantity of corn is sent from hence, as well to England as to Holland. They have likewise a good share of the Norway trade. And as they are concerned in the herring fishery, they consequently have some East country trade, viz. to Danzig, Königsberg, Riga, and the neighboring parts. They send ships also to Sweden, and import iron, copper, tar, pitch, deals, and from the several trading ports of that kingdom. These several trades occasion a concourse of shipping at the port, and there are not a few ships belonging to the place. The country behind them called the Carse, or the Carse of Gowrie, with the vale mentioned above of Strathmore, for Strath, in their dialect, signifies a vale, or level country. I say, all that country abounds in corn, and the port of Dundee ships off great quantities, when a plentiful crop allows it, to the great advantage of the gentlemen as well as farmers. For as the gentlemen receive all their rents in kind, they would find a great difficulty sometimes to dispose of it, if the merchant here did not ship it off either for London or Amsterdam. The town of Dundee stands at a little distance from the Tay, but they are joined by a causeway or walk, well paved with flat freestone, such as the sideways in Cheapside and Cornhill, and rows of trees are planted on either side the walk, which makes it very agreeable. On one part of this walk are very good warehouses for merchandises, especially for heavy goods, and also granaries for corn, of which sometimes they have a vast quantity laid up here. And these being near the harbour are convenient, as well for the housing of goods, when landed, as for the easy shipping off what lies for exportation. The great church was formerly collegiate, being the cathedral of the place, and was a very large building, but part of it was demolished in the Civil War. The remainder is divided, like as others are at Edinburgh, Glasgow, and into 3 churches for the present use of the citizens. They have also a meeting house or 2 for the episcopal worship. For you are to take it once for all, that north by Tay, there are far more of the episcopal persuasion than are to be found in the south, and the farther north, the more so, as we shall see in its order. The tower upon the great church here is a handsome square building, large and antient, but very high, and is a good ornament to the city. It resembles the great tower upon the cathedral of Canterbury, but not quite so high. There is a fine and well-endowed hospital for decayed townsmen of Dundee, where they are well taken care of, and provided for. The Pretender was in this city soon after his landing, and stayed here some time before he advanced to Scone. The Laird of Claverhouse of the name of Graham, who was killed, as has been said, at the Battle of Gillicranky, was made Viscount of Dundee by King James VII, but enjoyed it not long. His seat of Claverhouse is not far off, and he had the estate annexed to the Constabulary of Dundee, given him with the title, but 'tis now in the Duke of Douglas. It is 20 Scots miles from Dundee to Montrose, the way pleasant, the country fruitful and bespangled, as the sky in a clear night with stars of the biggest magnitude, with gentlemen's houses, thick as they can be suppository to stand with pleasure and conveniency. Among these is the noble palace of Penmure, forfeited in the late rebellion by the unfortunate Earl of Penmure, who was himself wounded in the fight near Dumlane, and with that action ruined a noble and antient family, and a fine estate. The surname of the family is Mall, and Malsburg, a small port near Montrose, bears the name still to posterity. The town and port of Montrose, vulgarly, but ignorantly, called Montrose, was our next stage, standing upon the eastmost shore of Angus, open to the German, or, if you please now, the Caledonian Ocean, and at the mouth of the little river South Esk, which makes the harbour. We did not find so kind a reception among the common people of Angus, and the other shires on this side the country, as the Scots usually give to strangers, but we found it was because we were Englishmen. And we found that their aversion did not lie so much against us on account of the late successes at, and after the rebellion, and the forfeiture of the many noblemen's and gentlemen's estates among them as fell on that occasion. Though that might add to the disgust, but it was on account of the union, which they almost universally exclaimed against, though sometimes against all manner of just reasoning. This town of Montrose is a seaport, and, in proportion to its number of inhabitants, has a considerable trade, and is tolerably well built and capable of being made strong, only that it extends too far in length. The French fleet made land at this port, when they had the Pretender on board, in the reign of Queen Anne, having overshot the mouth of the Firth so far, whither they had first designed, but this mistake, which some thought a misfortune, was certainly a deliverance to them. For as this mistake gave time to the English fleet to come up with them, before they could enter the Firth, so it left them time and room also to make their escape, which, if they had been gone up the Firth, they could never have done, but must inevitably have been all burnt and destroyed, or taken by the British fleet under Sir George Byng, which was superior to them in force. From Montrose the shore lies due north to Aberdeen. By the way is the castle of Dunedin, a strong fortification, upon a high precipice of a rock, looking down on the sea, as on a thing infinitely below it. The castle is walled about with invincible walls, said the honest Scots man that shewed us the road to it, having towers at proper distances, after the old way of fortifying towns. This was chiefly made use of as a prison for state prisoners. And I have seen a black account of the cruel usage the unhappy prisoners have met with there, but those times are over with Scotland. The Earl Marshal, of the name of Keith, was the lord of this castle, as also of a good house near it, but not a great estate, and what he had is now gone, for being in the late rebellion his estate is forfeited. And we are told his lordship, making his escape, is now in the service of Spain, where he commands an Irish regiment of foot. From hence there is nothing remarkable till we come to Aberdeen, a place so eminent, that it commands some stay upon it. Yet, I shall contract its description as much as possible, the compass of my work being so great, and the room I have for it so small. Aberdeen is divided into 2 towns or cities, and stands at the mouth of 2 rivers. The towns are the New and the Old Aberdeen, about a mile distant from one another, one situate on the river Don or Doon, the other on the river Dee, from whence it is suppository to take its name. For Aber, in the old British language, signifies a mouth, or opening of a river, the same which in Scotland is understood by a frith or firth, so that both these towns are described in the name, viz. Aberdeen, the mouth of the river Dee, and Aberdeen, the mouth of the river Don. So in the southwest part of the shores of Britain, and in Wales, we have Aberconway, the mouth of the river Conway, Aberystwyth, and several others. The old Aberdeen, on the bank of the Don, must, without doubt, be very antient, for they tell us the new Aberdeen is suppository to be upwards of 1,200 years old. Nor do any of their registers tell us the particular time of its being built, or by whom. The cities are equally situated for trade, being upon the very edge of the sea, and 'tis the common opinion, that part of the old city was washed down by the sea, so that it obliged the citizens to build farther off. This part was that they called the monastery, and this may give rise to that opinion, that thereupon they went and built the new Aberdeen upon the bank of the other river, and which, 'tis evident, is built upon a piece of hilly ground, or upon 3 hills, but this is all conjecture, and has only probability to support it, not anything of history. Old Aberdeen is also on one side the county, and New Aberdeen on another, though both in that which is called in general the county of Mar. The extraordinaries of Aberdeen, take both the cities together, are the cathedral, the 2 colleges, the great marketplace, the bridges, particularly that of one arch, the commerce, the fishery. The cathedral dedicated to Saint Machar, though none knows who that saint was, is a large and antient building. The building majestic, rather than curious, and yet not without its beauty in architecture. It appears to have been built at several times, and, perhaps, at the distance of many years, one part from another. The columns on which the great steeple stands are very artful, and the contrivance shews great judgment in the builder or director of the work. This church has been divided into several parts since the abolishing of episcopacy, as a government in the church, for it is not abolished in Aberdeen, as a principle. To this day, abundance of the people are still episcopal in their opinion. And they have, by the gentle government they live under, so much liberty still, as that they have a chapel for the public exercise of their worship, after the manner of the Church of England, besides several meetings for the episcopal dissenters, which are not so public. The two colleges, one of these are in the old city, and the other in the new. That in the old city is also the oldest college, being founded anno 1500. By the famous Bishop Elphinstone, who lies buried in the chapel or college church, under a very magnificent and curious monument. The steeple of this church was the most artificial that I have seen in Scotland, and very beautiful, according to the draught of its old building, but it is much more so now, having been injured, if not quite broken down by a furious tempest anno 1361. But rebuilt after the first model by the care, and at the expense of the Bishop Dr. Forbes, as also of Dr. Gordon M.D. and several considerable benefactors. I have not room to go through the particular account of this foundation. Take it in short in its original, that it consists of a principal or master, or head, call it as you please, with a sub-principal, which is not usual, who is also a professor of philosophy, a professor of divinity, 3 professors of the civil law, now reduced to but 1, 3 professors of philosophy, who are called regents, besides the sub-principal, 1 professor of the oriental tongues, 1 professor of the mathematics, 1 professor of physique. There were formerly an organist, 5 choristers, and 10 other fellows, as we may call them, but who were called also professors. In those days also they had a chancellor, who was always the bishop, and they conferred the degrees of Doctor of Divinity, which they do not now, except on extraordinary occasions. King James IV was the patron of this college, but its settlement was from Pope Alexander VI. With large privileges, equal to that of Paris and of Bononia, the bull for which is still extant. And from this, that king thus espousing the house, it obtained the name of King's College, though the bishop was the founder, as is said above. The founder also gave a library, and many other costly things. But they, it seems, suffered in the change of times very much. The new college, which is in the new city of Aberdeen, and is called the Marshallian or Marshal's College, because founded by Keith Earl Marshall, in the year 1593. And though it was a magnificent building at first, and well endowed, yet the citizens have much beautified and enlarged it, and adjoined to it a noble library well stocked with books, as well by the citizens as by the benefactions of gentlemen and lovers of learning, as also with the finest and best mathematical instruments. This college likewise consists of a principal, a professor of divinity, 4 professors of philosophy, called regents, a professor of the mathematics, a professor of physique, also a humanities school with a master and 3 ushers, and a music school. The humanities school was founded by Dr. Doon. Those 2 colleges form the university, and are so called, but they are independent on one another. They are famed for having bred many men of learning, but that is not to my purpose here. The 3rd article is the great marketplace, which, indeed, is very beautiful and spacious. And the streets adjoining are very handsome and well built, the houses lofty and high, but not so as to be inconvenient, as in Edinburgh, or low, to be contemptible as in most other places. But the generality of the citizens' houses are built of stone 4-story high, handsome sash windows, and are very well furnished within, the citizens here being as gay, as genteel, and, perhaps, as rich, as in any city in Scotland. The bridges, particularly that at Old Aberdeen, over the Don, it consists of one immense arch of stone, sprung from 2 rocks, one on each side, which serve as abutment to the arch, so that it may be said to have no foundation, nor to need any. The workmanship is artful, and so firm, that it may possibly end with the conflagration only. The other bridge is upon the River Dee, about a mile west above New Aberdeen, and has 7 very stately fine arches. There are several other buildings which should be described, if our work was to dwell here, as the almshouses, hospitals, the great church of St. Nicholas, divided into 3, with the steeple, and the two vast bells in it. The custom house, the wharf, the port, all which, considering what part of the world they are in, are really extraordinary, and that brings me to the 5th and 6th articles, which are, indeed, of the same kind, viz. 5 and 6. The commerce and the fishery. The fishery is very particular, the salmon is a surprising thing, the quantity that is taken in both rivers, but especially in the Dee, is a kind of prodigy. The fishing, or property, is erected into a company, and divided into shares, and no person can enjoy above one share at a time. The profits are very considerable, for the quantity of fish taken is exceeding great, and they are sent abroad into several parts of the world, particularly into France, England, the Baltic, and several other parts. The herring fishing is a common blessing to all this shore of Scotland, and is like the Indies at their door. The merchants of Aberdeen cannot omit the benefit, and with this they are able to carry on their trade to Danzig and Koningsberg, Riga and Narva, Wyburg and Stockholm, to the more advantage. They have a very good manufacture of linen, and also of worsted stockings, which they send to England in great quantities, and of which they make some so fine, that I have seen them sold for 14 and 20 shillings a pair. They also send them over to Holland, and into the North and East Seas in large quantities. They have also a particular export here of pork, pickled and packed up in barrels, which they chiefly sell to the Dutch for the victualling their East India ships and their men of war. The Aberdeen pork having the reputation of being the best curd, for keeping on very long voyages, of any in Europe. They export also corn and meal, but they generally bring it from the Firth of Murray, or Cromarty, the corn coming from about Inverness where they have great quantities. In a word, the people of Aberdeen are universal merchants, so far as the trade of the northern part of the world will extend. They drive a very great trade to Holland, to France, to Hambro, to Norway, to Gothenburg, and to the Baltic. And it may, in a word, be esteemed as the third city in Scotland, that is to say, next after Edinburgh and Glasgow. From Aberdeen the coast goes on to a point of land, which is the farthest northeast part of Britain, and is called by the sailors Buchanus, being in the shire or county of Buchan. It was to this point the French squadron, with the Pretender on board, in the reign of Queen Anne, kept their flight in sight of the shore, being thus far pursued by Sir George Byng with the English fleet, but from hence steering away northeast. As if for the Norway coast, and the English admiral seeing no probability of coming up with them, gave over the chase, when they, altering their course in the night, stood away south, and came back to Dunkirk where they set out. Upon this part are several good towns, as particularly Peterhead, a good market town, and a port with a small harbour for fishing vessels, but no considerable trade, Aberdeen being so near. This country, however remote, is full of nobility and gentry, and their seats are seen even to the extremest shores. The family of Fraser carries its name to Fraserburgh, on the very northernmost point of the county. Ereskines, Earls of Mar, have their family seat at Kildrummy, in the county of Mar, a little south of this part of the country, where the late unhappy Earl first set up his standard of the Pretender. The Hayes, Earls of Errol, are in Buchan. And the family of Forbes, Lord Forbes, and Forbes Lord Pitsligo, are still farther, and the latter on the very shore of the Caledonian Ocean. Nor does the remote situation hinder, but these gentlemen have the politest and brightest education and genius of any people so far north, perhaps, in the world, being always bred in travel abroad, and in the universities at home. The Lord Pitsligo, just mentioned, though unhappily drawn into the snare of the late insurrection, and forfeiting his estate with the rest, yet carries abroad with him, wherever he goes, a bright genius. A head as full of learning and sound judgment, and a behavior as polite, courtly, and full of all the good qualities that adorn a noble birth, as most persons of quality I ever saw. Mr. Camden relates, that on the coast of this country a great piece of amber was driven on shore by the force of the sea, as big, to use his own words, as a horse. I shall add nothing to the story, because 'tis hard to give credit to it. It is enough that I name my author, for I could not learn from the inhabitants that they ever saw any more of it. From hence, the east shore of Scotland being at an end, the land trends away due west. And the Shire of Banff beginning, you see the towns of Banff, Elgin, and the famous monastery of Kinloss, where the murdered body of King Duff was, after many years, dug up, and discovered to be the same by some tokens, which, it seems, were undoubted. From this point of the land, I mean Buchan-Ness, the ships take their distances, or accounts, for their several voyages. And what they call their departure, as in England, they do from Winterton-Ness, on the northeast part of Norfolk, or in the Downs for the voyages to the southward. From Fife-Ness, which is the northernmost point, or headland on the mouth of Edinburgh Firth, being the southermost land of Fife, to this point of Buchan-Ness, the land lies due north and south, and the shore is the eastermost land of Scotland. The distance between them is 33 leagues 1 mile, that is just 100 miles, though the mariners say that measuring by the sea it is but 28. And from Winterton-Ness, near Yarmouth, to this point called Buchan-Ness, is just 300 miles. The river, or Firth of Tay, opens into the sea, about 4 leagues north from Fife-Ness. And as there is a lighthouse on the Isle of May, in the mouth of the Firth of Forth of Edinburgh, a little south of this point called Fife-Ness. So there are 2 lighthouses at the entrance of the Firth of Tay, being for the directions of the sailors, when they are bound into that river. And particularly for their avoiding and sailing between 2 sands or shoals, which lie off from the south side of the entrance. This point of land, called Buchan-Ness, is generally the first land of Great Britain, which the ships make in their voyages home from Archangel in Russia, or from their whale-fishing voyages to Greenland and Spitzbergen in the North Seas. And near this point, namely, at Pitsligo, a great ship was cast away in Queen Elizabeth's time, bound home from Archangel, in which was the first ambassador, which the great Duke of Muscovy sent to any of the Christian princes of Europe, and who was commissioned to treat with Queen Elizabeth for a league of peace and commerce. And on board which was a most valuable present to the Queen of rich and costly furs, such as sables, ermine, black fox skins, and such like, being in those days esteemed inestimable. The ambassadors, it seems, were saved and brought on shore by the help of the people of Pitsligo, but the ship and all the goods, and among them the rich furs, intended for the Queen, were all lost, to Her Majesty's great disappointment. For the Queen valued such fine things exceedingly. At the town of Peterhead there is a small harbour with 2 small piers. But it is all dry at low water, so that the smallest ships lie aground, and can only go in and out at high water, and then only small vessels. From this point of easterly land all that great bay, or inlet of the sea, reaching quite to the north of Scotland, is called Murray Firth, and the northernmost point is Dungsby Head, which is the east point of Caithness, and opens to Pentland Firth. By Pentland Firth you are to understand the passage of the sea beyond Caithness, that is to say between Scotland and the Isles of Orkney. This bay, called Murray Firth, is not in the nature of a firth, as that of Edinburgh or Tay, being the mouths of rivers, as the Humber, or the mouth of Thames in England, but it is an open gulf or bay in the sea. As the Bay of Biscay, or the Gulf of Mexico are, and such like, and though it may receive several rivers into it, as indeed it does, and as those bays do, yet itself is an open sea, and reaches from, as I have said, Peterhead to Dungsby Head, opposite to the Orkneys, the distance upon the sea 26 leagues 1 mile, or 79 miles. But it is almost twice as far by land, because of the depth of that bay, which obliges us to travel from Pitsligo, west, near 70 miles, till we come to Inverness. This country of Buchan, is, indeed, more to be taken notice of from what is to be seen on the seashore than in the land, for the country is mountainous, poor, and more barren than its neighbours. But as we coasted along west, we came into a much better country, particularly the shires of Banff, Elgin, and the country of Murray, from whence the bay, I just now mentioned, is called Murray Firth. Murray is, indeed, a pleasant country, the soil fruitful, watered with fine rivers, and full of good towns, but especially of gentlemen's seats, more and more remarkable than could, indeed, be expected by a stranger in so remote a part of the country. The river Spey, which even Mr. Camden himself calls a noble river, passes through the middle of the country. Upon the bank of this river the Duke of Gordon has a noble seat called after his name, Castle Gordon. It is, indeed, a noble, large, and antient seat. As a castle much is not to be said of it, for old fortifications are of a small import, as the world goes now, but as a dwelling or palace for a nobleman, it is a very noble, spacious, and royal building. 'Tis only too large, and appears rather as a great town than as a house. The present Duke has been embroiled a little in the late unhappy affair of the Pretender. But he got off without a forfeiture, having prudently kept himself at a distance from them till he might see the effect of things. The Duke has several other seats in this part of the country, and, which is still better, has a very great estate. All the country, on the west side of the Spey, is surprisingly agreeable, being a flat, level country, the land rich and fruitful, well peopled, and full of gentlemen's seats. This country is a testimony how much the situation of the land is concerned in the goodness of the climate. For here the land being level and plain, for between 20 and 30 miles together, the soil is not only fruitful and rich, but the temperature of the air is softened, and made mild and suitable to the fruitfulness of the earth. For the harvest in this country, and in the Vale of Strathbogie, and all the country to Inverness, is not only forward and early, as well as rich and strong. But 'tis more early than in Northumberland, nay, than it is in Derbyshire, and even than in some parts of the most southerly counties in England, as particularly in the east of Kent. As a confirmation of this, I affirm that I have seen the new wheat of this country and Inverness brought to market to Edinburgh, before the wheat at Edinburgh has been fit to reap. And yet the harvest about Edinburgh is thought to be as forward as in most parts, even of England itself. In a word, it is usual for them to begin their harvest, in Murray and the country about it, in the month of July, and it is not very unusual to have new corn fully ripe and threshed out, shipped off, and brought to Edinburgh to sale within the month of August. Nor is the forwardness of the season the only testimony of the goodness of the soil here, but the crops are large, the straw strong and tall, and the ear full. And that which is still more the grain, and that particularly of the wheat, is as full, and the kind as fine, as any I have seen in England. In this rich country is the city, or town rather, of Elgin. I say city, because in antient time the monks claimed it for a city, and the cathedral shews, by its ruins, that it was a place of great magnificence. Nor must it be wondered at, if in so pleasant, so rich, and so agreeable a part of the country, all the rest being so differing from it, the clergy should seat themselves in a proportioned number, seeing we must do them the justice to say, that if there is any place richer and more fruitful, and pleasant than another, they seldom fail to find it out. As the country is rich and pleasant, so here are a great many rich inhabitants, and in the town of Elgin in particular. For the gentlemen, as if this was the Edinburgh, or the court, for this part of the island, leave their highland habitations in the winter and come and live here for the diversion of the place and plenty of provisions. And there is, on this account, a great variety of gentlemen for society, and that of all parties and of all opinions. This makes Elgin a very agreeable place to live in, notwithstanding its distance, being above 450 measured miles from London, and more, if we must go by Edinburgh. This rich country continues with very little intermission, till we come to Strathnairn, that is the valley of Nairn, where it extends a little farther in breadth towards the mountains. Nor is Strathnairn behind any of the other in fruitfulness. From the western part of this country you may observe that the land goes away again to the north. And, as if you were to enter into another island beyond Britain, you find a large lake or inlet from the Sea of Murray, mentioned above, going on west, as if it were to cut through the island, for we could see no end of it. Nor could some of the country people tell us how far it went, but that it reached to Lochaber, so that we thought, till our maps and farther inquiries informed us, it had joined to the Western Ocean. After we had travelled about 12 miles, and descended from a rising ground, which we were then upon, we perceived the lake contracted in one particular place to the ordinary size of a river, as if designed by nature to give passage to the inhabitants to converse with the northern part. And then, as if that part had been sufficiently performed, it opened again to its former breadth, and continued in the form of a large lake, as before, for many more miles than we could see, being in the whole, according to Mr. Camden, 23 miles long, but if it be taken on both sides the pass, 'tis above 35 miles in length. This situation must necessarily make the narrow part be a most important pass, from the south part of Scotland to the northern countries, which are beyond it. We have been told the Romans never conquered thus far. And those that magnify the conquests of Oliver Cromwell in Scotland to a height beyond what was done by the Romans, insist much upon it, that the Romans never came into this part of the country, but, if what Mr. Camden records, and what is confirmed by other accounts from the men of learning and of observation, this must be a mistake, for Mr. Camden says, that near Beancastle in the county of Nairn, there was found, in the year 1460, a fine marble vessel finely carved, which was full of Roman coins of several sorts. Also several old forts or mounts have been seen here, which, by their remains, evidently shewed themselves to be Roman, but that inquiry is none of my work. In the narrow pass, mentioned above over the lake, stands the town and fortress of Inverness, that is a town on the inner bank of the river Ness. The situation of it, as I have said before, intimates that it is a place of strength. And accordingly it has a castle, founded in antient times to command the pass, and some authors write that it was anciently a royal house for the kings of Scotland. Be that as it will, Oliver Cromwell thought it a place of such importance, that he built a strong citadel here, and kept a stated garrison always in it, and sometimes more than a garrison. Finding it needful to have a large body of his old veteran troops posted here to preserve the peace of the country, and keep the Highlands in awe, which they did effectually ail his time. Here it is observed, that at the end of those troublesome days, when the troops on all sides came to be disbanded, and the men dispersed, abundance of the English soldiers settled in this fruitful and cheap part of the country. And two things are observed from it as the consequence. That the English falling to husbandry, and cultivation of the earth after their own manner, were instrumental, with the help of a rich and fruitful soil, to bring all that part of the country into so good a method and management, as is observed to outdo all the rest of Scotland to this day. And this not a little contributes to the harvest being so early, and the corn so good, as is said above. For as they reap early, so they sow early, and manure and help the soil by all the regular arts of husbandry, as is practised in England, and which, as they learnt it from England, and by English men, so they preserve the knowledge of it. And also the industry attending it, and required for it to this day. As Cromwell's soldiers initiated them thus into the arts and industry of the husbandman, so they left them the English accent upon their tongues, and they preserve it also to this day. For they speak perfect English, even much better than in the most southerly provinces of Scotland, nay, some will say that they speak it as well as at London, though I do not grant that neither. It is certain they keep the southern accent very well, and speak very good English. They have also much of the English way of living among them, as well in their manner of dress and customs, as also of their eating and drinking, and even of their dressing and cookery, which we found here much more agreeable to English stomachs than in other parts of Scotland. All which, and several other usages and customs, they retain from the settling of 3 regiments of English soldiers here, after they were disbanded, and who had, at least many of them, their wives and children with them. The fort, which was then built, and since demolished, has been restored since the Revolution, and a garrison was always kept here by King William, for the better regulating the Highlands. And this post was of singular importance in the time of the late insurrection of the Lord Mar for the Pretender. When, though his party took it, they were driven out again by the country, with the assistance of the Earl of Sutherland, and several other of the nobility and gentry, who stood fast to the king's interest. Here is a stately stone bridge of 7 large arches over the river Ness, where, as I said above, it grows narrow between the sea and the lake. Small vessels may come up to the town, but larger ships, when such come thither, as they often do for corn, lie at some distance east from the town. When you are over this bridge you enter that which we truly call the north of Scotland, and others the North Highlands, in which are several distinct shires, but cannot call for a distinct description, because it is all one undistinguished range of mountains and woods, overspread with vast, and almost uninhabited rocks and steeps filled with deer innumerable, and of a great many kinds, among which are some of those the ancients called harts and roebucks, with vast overgrown stags and hinds of the red deer kind, and with fallow deer also. And here, before I describe this frightful country, it is needful to observe that Scotland may be thus divided into 4 districts or distinct quarters, which, however, I have not seen any of our geographers do before me, yet, I believe, may not be an improper measurement for such as would form a due idea of the whole in their minds, as follows. The South Land, or that part of Scotland south of the River Tay, drawing a line from the Tay, about Perth, to Loch Lomond, and down again to Dumbarton, and the bank of Clyde. The Middle, or Midland, being all the country from the Tay and the Loch Lomond, north to the Lake of Ness and the Aber, including a long slope to the south, taking in the western highlands of Argyll and Lorne, and the Isles of Isla and Jura. The North Land, being all the country beyond Inverness and the Loch, or River Ness, north, drawing the line over the narrow space of Glengarry, between the Ness and the Aber, and bounded by them both from the eastern to the western sea. The islands, being all the western and northern islands, viz., the Hebrides, the Skye, the Orkneys, and the Isles of Shetland. Upon the foot of this division I am now, having passed the bridge over the Ness, entered upon the 3rd division of Scotland, called the North Land. And it is of this country that, as I am saying, the mountains are so full of deer, harts, roebucks, and here are also a great number of eagles which breed in the woods, and which prey upon the young fawns when they first fall. Some of these eagles are of a mighty large kind, such as are not to be seen again in those parts of the world. Here are also the best hawks of all the kinds for sport which are in the kingdom, and which the nobility and gentry of Scotland make great use of, for not this part of Scotland only, but all the rest of the country abounds with wildfowl. The rivers and lakes also in all this country are prodigiously full of salmon. It is hardly credible what the people relate of the quantity of salmon taken in these rivers, especially in the Spey, the Nairn, the Ness, and other rivers thereabout. The several countries beyond the Ness are Ross, Sutherland, Caithness, Strathnaver. And beyond those the islands of Orkney and Shetland. The Earl of Sutherland has a castle beyond Inverness, called Dunrobin, situate on the eastern shore, which his lordship was sent down by sea to take an early possession of in the late rebellion. And which, if he had not done, would soon have fallen into the hands of the late Earl of Mar's party. But by his coming timely thither it was prevented, and the country on that side kept from joining the troops of the Pretender, at least for that time. Inverness is a pleasant, clean, and well-built town. There are some merchants in it, and some good share of trade. It consists of 2 parishes, and 2 large, handsome streets, but no public buildings of any note, except as above, the old castle and the bridge. North of the mouth of this river is the famous Cromarty Bay, or Cromarty Firth, noted for being the finest harbour, with the least business, of, perhaps, any in Britain. 'Tis, doubtless, a harbour or port, able to receive the Royal Navy of Great Britain, and, like Milford Haven in Wales, both the going in and out safe and secure, but as there is very little shipping employed in these parts, and little or no trade, except for corn, and in the season of it some fishing, so this noble harbour is left entirely useless in the world. Our geographers seem to be almost as much at a loss in the description of this north part of Scotland, as the Romans were to conquer it. And they are obliged to fill it up with hills and mountains, as they do the inner parts of Africa, with lions and elephants, for want of knowing what else to place there. Yet this country is not of such difficult access, as to be passed undescribed, as if it were impenetrable. Here being on the coast Dorna a royal burg, situate upon the sea, opposite to that which they call Tarbat Bay, eminent for the prodigious quantity of herrings taken, or, which rather might be taken here in their season. There is a castle here belonging also to the Earl of Sutherland, and it was the seat of a bishop, but the cathedral, which is but mean, is now otherwise employed. All the country beyond this river, and the loch flowing into it, is called Caithness, and extends to the northernmost land in Scotland. Some people tell us they have both lead, copper, and iron in this part of Scotland, and I am very much inclined to believe it, but it seems reserved for a future, and more industrious age to search into. Which, if it should happen to appear, especially the iron, they would no more have occasion to say, that nature furnished them with so much timber, and woods of such vast extent to no purpose. Seeing it may be all little enough to supply the forges for working up the iron stone, and improving that useful product, and should a time come when these hidden treasures of the earth should be discovered and improved. This part of Scotland may no longer be called poor, for such a production would soon change the face of things, bring wealth and people and commerce to it. Fill their harbours full of ships, their towns full of people, and, by consuming the provisions, bring the soil to be cultivated, its fish cured, and its cattle consumed at home, and so a visible prosperity would shew itself among them. Nor are the inhabitants so wild and barbarous as, perhaps, they were in those times, or as our writers have pretended. We see every day the gentlemen born here, such as the Mackenzies, Macleans, Dundonalds, Gordons, Mackays, and others, who are nommed among the clans as if they were barbarians, appear at court, and in our camps and armies, as polite, and as finished gentlemen as any from other countries, or even among our own. And, if I should say, outdoing our own in many things, especially in arms and gallantry, as well abroad as at home. But I am not writing panegyrics or satires here, my business is with the country. There is no room to doubt, but in this remote part of the island the country is more wild and uncultivated, as it is mountainous, and, in some parts, thinner of inhabitants, than in the more southern parts of the island. Here are few towns, but the people live dispersed, the gentry leading the commons or vassals, as they are called, to dwell within the respective bounds of their several clans, where they are, as we may say, little monarchs, reigning in their own dominions. Nor do the people know any other sovereign, at least many of them do not. This occasions the people to live dispersed among the hills without any settled towns. Their employment is chiefly hunting, which is, as we may say, for their food. Though they do also breed large quantities of black cattle, with which they pay their lairds or leaders the rent of the lands, and these are the cattle which, even from the remotest parts, as well as from other in the west and south, are driven annually to England to be sold, and are brought up even to London, especially into the countries of Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex. Having thus, as I say, few or no towns to describe north of Inverness, it must suffice that I thus give a just description of the country in general. For example, it is surrounded with the sea, and those two great inlets of water, mentioned above, called the Ness and the Abra, so that except a small part, or neck of land, reaching from one to the other, and which is not above 6 miles, I mean that country which Mr. Camden calls the Garrow, or Glengarrow, others Glengarry. I say, this neck of land excepted, the whole division, as formed above under the head of the North Land, would be a distinct island, separated from all the rest of Great Britain, as effectually as the Orkneys or the Isle of Skye is separated from this. In a word, the great northern ocean surrounds this whole part of Scotland. That part of it to the east, mentioned just now, lies open to the sea without any cover. The west and north parts are, as it were, surrounded with outworks as defences, to break off the raging ocean from the north. For the western islands on one side, and the Orkneys on the other, lie as so many advanced fortifications or redoubts, to combat that enemy at a distance. I shall view them in their course. From Dunrobin Castle, which, I mentioned before, you have nothing of note offers itself either by sea or land, but an extended shore lying north and south without towns and without harbours, and indeed, as there are none of the first, so there are wanting none of the last, for, as I said Cromarty Bay, there is a noble harbour without ships or trade. So here nature, as if providentially foreseeing there was no room for trade, forbore giving herself the trouble to form harbours and creeks where they should be useless, and without people. The land thus extended as above, lies north and south to Dungsby Head, which is the utmost extent of the land on the east side of Britain, north, and is distant from Cromarty 18 leagues north. This point of Dingsby, or Dungsby Head, is in the north part, as I observed of Buchan and Winterton before. 'Tis the place from whence the sailors take their distances, and keep their accounts in their going farther north, as for example, from this point of Dingsby Head to the Fair Isle, which is the first of Shetland, or the last of the Orkneys, call it which we will, for it lies between both, is 25 leagues, 75 miles. From the same Dingsby Head to Sumburgh Head, that is to Shetland, is 32 leagues, 96 miles, and to Lerwick Fort in Shetland no miles. Thus from Buchan-Ness to Sumburgh Head in Shetland, is 47 leagues. And from Winterton Ness near Yarmouth, on the coast of Norfolk, to Buchan-Ness, on the coast of Aberdeen, is just 100 leagues. So from Winterton to Shetland is 147 leagues, 441 miles. But this is the proper business of the mariners. I am now to observe that we are here at the extreme end or point of the island of Great Britain. And that here the land bears away west, leaving a large strait or sea, which they call Pentland Firth, and which divides, between the island of Great Britain and the Isles of the Orkneys. A passage broad and fair, for 'tis not less than 5 leagues over, and with a great depth of water. So that any ships, or fleets of ships may go through it, but the tides are so fierce, so uncertain, and the gusts and sudden squalls of wind so frequent, that very few merchant ships care to venture through it. And the Dutch East India ships, which come north about, as 'tis called, in their return from India, keep all farther off, and choose to come by Fair Isle, that is to say, in the passage between the islands of Orkney and Shetland. And here the Dutch send their squadron of men of war generally to meet them, because, as if it were in a narrow lane, they are sure to meet with them there. Here the passage is not only broader, for it is at least 9 leagues from North Ranelagh, the farthest island of the Orkneys, to Fair Isle, and 5 more from Fair Isle to Shetland, so that they have a passage of 14 leagues between the Orkneys and Shetland. With only a small island in the way, which has nothing dangerous about it. Also the mountainous country being now all out of reach, the sea is open and calm, as in other places, nor is there any dangerous current or shoals to disturb them. In the passage, between the Land's End of Britain and the Orkneys, is a small island, which our mariners call Stroma, Mr. Camden and others Sona. 'Tis spoken much of as dangerous for ships, but I see no room to record anything of that kind any more than that there are witches and spirits haunting it, which draw ships on shore to their misfortunes. Such things I leave to the people who are of the opinion the devil has such retreats for doing mischief. For my own part one believe him employed in business of more moment. As Dingsby Head is the most northerly land of Great Britain, 'tis worth observing to you that here, in the month of June, we had so clear an uninterrupted day, that, though indeed the sun does set, that is to say, the horizon covers its whole body for some hours, yet you might see to read the smallest print, and to write distinctly, without the help of a candle, or any other light, and that all night long. No wonder the Antient mariners, be they Phoenician or Carthaginian, or what else you please, who in those days knew nothing of the motion of the heavenly bodies, when they were driven thus far, were surprised at finding they had lost the steady rotation of day and night, which they thought had spread over the whole globe. No wonder they talked much of their Ultima Thule, and that the Elysian fields must lie this way. When they found that they were already come to everlasting day, they could no longer doubt but heaven lay that way, or at least that this was the high way to it. And accordingly, when they came home, and were to give an account of these things among their neighbours, they filled them with astonishment, and 'twas wonderful they did not really fit out ships for the Disco Very. For who would ever have gone so near heaven, and not ventured a little farther to see whether they could find it or no? From hence west we go along the shore of the Firth or passage, which they call Pentland. And here is the house so famous, called John a Groat's house, where we set our horses' feet into the sea, on the most northerly land, as the people say, of Britain, though, I think, Dingsby Head is as far north. 'Tis certain, however, the difference is but very small, being either of them in the latitude of 591/6 north, and Shetland reaching above 2 degrees farther. The dominions of Great Britain are extended from the Isle of Wight, in the latitude of 50 degrees, to the Isles of Unsta in Shetland, in the latitude of 61 degrees, 30 minutes, being 10 degrees, or full 600 miles in length. Which island of Unsta being the most remote of the Isles of Shetland to the northeast, lies 167 leagues from Winterton Ness in Norfolk. Here we found, however mountainous and wild the country appeared, the people were extremely well furnished with provisions, and especially they had 4 sorts of provisions in great plenty. And with a supply of which 'tis reasonable to say they could suffer no dangerous want. Very good bread, as well oat bread as wheat, though the last not so cheap as the first. Venison exceeding plentiful, and at all seasons, young or old, which they kill with their guns wherever they find it, for there is no restraint, but 'tis every man's own that can kill it. By which means the Highlanders not only have all of them firearms, but they are all excellent marksmen. Salmon in such plenty as is scarce credible, and so cheap, that to those who have any substance to buy with, it is not worth their while to catch it themselves. This they eat fresh in the season, and for other times they cure it by drying it in the sun, by which they preserve it all the year. They have no want of cows and sheep, but the latter are so wild, that sometimes were they not, by their own disposition, used to flock together, they would be much harder to kill than the deer. From hence to the west point of the passage to Orkney is near 20 miles, being what may be called the end of the island of Britain, and this part faces directly to the North Pole. The land, as it were, looking forward just against the pole star, and the poles so elevated, that the tail of the Ursa Major, or the Great Bear, is seen just in the zenith, or over your head. And the day is said to be 18 hours long, that is to say, the sun is so long above the horizon, but the rest of the light is so far beyond a twilight, by reason of the smallness of the arch of that circle, which the sun makes beneath the horizon, that it is clear and perfect day almost all the time. Not forgetting withal, that the dark nights take their turn with them in their season, and it is just as long night in the winter. Yet it is observable here, that they have more temperate winters here generally speaking, than we have to the most southerly part of the island, and particularly the water in some of the rivers as in the Ness, for example, never freezes. Nor are their frosts ordinarily so lasting as they are in the most southerly climates, which is accounted for from the nearness of the sea, which filling the air with moist vapors, thickens the fluids and causes that they are not so easily penetrated by the severity of the cold. On this account the snows also are not so deep, neither do they lie so long upon the ground, as in other places, except it be on some of the high hills, in the upper and innermost part of the country, where the tops or summits of the hills are continually covered with snow, and perhaps have been so for many ages, so that here if in any place of the world they may justly add to the description of their country. Vast watery lakes, which spread below, and mountains covered with eternal snow. On the most inland parts of this country, especially in the Shire of Ross, they have vast woods of fir trees, not planted and set by men's hands, as I have described in the southern part of Scotland, but growing wild and undirected. Otherwise than as nature planted and nourished them up, by the additional help of time, nay of ages. Here are woods reaching from 10 to 15 and 20 miles in length, and proportioned in breadth, in which there are firs, if we may believe the inhabitants, large enough to make masts for the biggest ships in the Navy Royal, and which are rendered of no use, merely for want of convenience of water carriage to bring them away. Also they assure us there are a sufficient quantity of other timber for a supply to all Britain. How far this may be true, that is to say, as to the quantity, that I do not undertake to determine, but I must add a needful memorandum to the Scots noblemen, and in whose estates these woods grow, that if they cannot be made useful one way, they may be made so another, and if they cannot fell the timber, and cut it into masts and deals, and other useful things for bringing away, having no navigation, they may yet burn it, and draw from it vast quantities of pitch, tar, rosin, turpentine, and which is of easier carriage, and may be carried on horses to the water's edge, and then shipped for the use of the merchant, and this way their woods may be made profitable, whatever they might be before. We find no manufactures among the people here, except it be that the women call their thrift, namely, spinning of woolen, or linen for their own uses, and indeed not much of that. Perhaps, the time may come, when they may be better and more profitably employed that way. For if as I have observed, they should once come to work the mines, which there is reason to believe are to be found there, and to search the bowels of the earth, for iron and copper, the people would soon learn to stay at home. And the women would find work as well as the men. But this must be left to time and posterity. We were now in the particular county called Strathnaver, or the Vale on the Naver, the remotest part of all the island, though not the most barren or unfruitful. For here as well as on the eastern shore is good corn produced, and sufficient of it at least for the inhabitants. Perhaps they do not send much abroad, though sometimes also they send it over to the Orkneys, and also to Shetland. This county belongs to the Earl of Sutherland, whose eldest son bears the title of Lord Strathnaver. And now leaving the northern prospect we pass the opposite point west from Dingsby Head, and which the people call Faro Head, though Mr. Camden, by what authority, or from what originals I know not, gives it a long account of, and calls these 2 points by 2 opposite names. The east point, or Dingsby Head, he calls Vervidrum Promontorium. The west point, or Faro Head, he calls Cerudrum Promontorium. From hence the vast western ocean appears. What name to give it the geographers themselves do not seem to agree, but it certainly makes a part of the great Atlantic Sea, and is to be called by no other name. For it has no land or country to derive from. And now we were to turn our faces for the islands of this sea, which make the 4th division of Scotland as mentioned before. I may if I have room give as just a description of them as I can from authentic relations. For being on horseback and no convenience of shipping presenting itself here, I am to own that we did not go over to those islands personally, neither was it likely any person whose business was mere curiosity and diversion should either be at the expense, or run the risque of such a hazardous passage where there was so little worth observation to be found. We therefore turned our faces to the south, and with great satisfaction after so long and fatiguing a journey. And unless we had been assisted by the gentlemen of the country, and with very good guides, it had been next to an impossibility to have passed over this part of the country. I do confess if I was to recommend to any men whose curiosity tempted them to travel over this country, the best method for their journeying, it should be neither to seek towns. For it would be impossible to find such in proper stages for their journey. Nor to make themselves always burthensome to the Highland chiefs, though there I can assure them they would always meet with good treatment, and great hospitality. But I would propose travelling with some company, and carrying tents with them, and so encamping every night as if they were an army. It is true they would do well to have the countenance of the gentlemen, and chiefs as above, and to be recommended to them from their friends from one to another, as well for guides as for safety. Otherwise I would not answer for what might happen, but if they are first well recommended as strangers, and have letters from one gentleman to another, they would want neither guides nor guards, nor indeed would any man touch them. But rather protect them if there was occasion in all places, and by this method they might in the summer time lodge, when, and wherever they pleased, with safety and pleasure, travelling no farther at a time, than they thought fit. And as for their provisions, they might supply themselves by their guns, with very great plenty of wild fowl, and their attendants and guides would find convenient places to furnish other things sufficient to carry with them. It would be no unpleasant account to relate a journey which 2 Scots and 3 English gentlemen, took in this manner for their diversion, in order to visit the late Duke of Gordon. But it would be too long for this place. It would be very diverting to shew how they LODG'd every night. How 2 Highlanders who attended them, and who had been in the army, went before every evening and pitched their little camp. How they furnished themselves with provisions, carried some with them, and dressed and prepared what they killed with their guns. And how very easily they travelled over all the mountains and wasts, without troubling themselves with houses or lodgings, but as I say the particulars are too long for this place. Indeed in our attempt to come down to the southward by the coast of Tyne, and the Shire of Ross, we should have been extremely disappointed, and perhaps have been obliged to get a ship or bark. To have carried us round the Isle of Skye into Lochaber, had it not been for the extraordinary courtesy of some of the gentlemen of the country. On the other hand we unexpectedly met here some English men, who were employed by merchants in the whether at London or Edinburgh I do not now remember, to take and cure a large quantity of white fish, and afterwards herrings, on account of trade. Here we had not only the civility of their assistance and accommodation in our journey, but we had the pleasure of seeing what progress they made in their undertaking. As for herrings indeed the quantity was prodigious, and we had the pleasure of seeing something of the prodigy, for I can call it no other. The shoal was as I might say beginning to come, or had sent their van couriers before them, when we first came to the head of Pentland Firth, and in a fortnight's time more, the body of their numberless armies began to appear. But before we left the coast you would have ventured to say of the sea, as they do of the river Tibiscus, or Theiss in Hungary, that it was 1/3 water, and 2/3 fish. The operation of taking them, could hardly be called fishing, for they did little more than dip for them into the water and take them up. As to the quantity, I make no scruple to say, that if there had been 10,000 ships there to have loaded with them, they might all have been filled and none of them missed. Nor did the fish seem to stay, but passed on to the south, that they might supply other parts, and make way also for those innumerable shoals which were to come after. Had the quantity of white fish been any way proportioned to the undertaking as the herring was, there would no doubt have been such encouragement to the merchant, that they would never have given it over. But they found it would not fully answer, not but there were great quantities of cod, and the fish very sizable and good. But not so great a quantity as to make that dispatch in taking them, as they are taken with hook and line, sufficient for loading of ships, or laying up a large quantity in the season. And this I doubt discouraged the undertaking, the merchants finding the expense to exceed the return. Here we found the town of Tain, and some other villages tolerably well inhabited, and some trade also, occasioned principally by the communication with the western islands, and also by the herring fishing. The fishing boats from other parts often putting into these ports. For all their coast is full of loughs and rivers, and other openings which make very good harbours of shipping. And that which is remarkable, some of those loughs, are infinitely full of herrings, even where, as they tell us, they have no communication with the sea, so that they must have in all probability been put into them alive by some particular hands. And have multiplied there as we find at this time. We could understand nothing on this side of what the people said, any more than if we had been in Morocco, and all the remedy we had was, that we found most of the gentlemen spoke Frenin, and some few spoke broad Scots. We found it also much for our convenience to make the common people believe we were French. Should we go about here to give you an account of the religion of the people in this country, it would be an unpleasant work, and perhaps scarce seem to deserve credit. You would hardly believe that in a Christian island, as this is said to be, there should be people found who know so little of religion, or of the custom of Christians, as not to know a Sunday, or Sabbath, from a working day. Or the worship of God from an ordinary meeting, for conversation. I do not affirm that it is so, and I shall say no more of it here, because I would not publish what it is to be hoped may in time find redress. But I cannot but say that His Majesty's gift of 1,000L annually to the Assembly of Scotland, for sending ministers and missionaries for the propagating Christian knowledge in the Highlands, is certainly one of the most needful charities that could have been thought of, worthy of a king, and well suited to that occasion. And if prudently applied, as there is reason to believe it will be, may in time break in upon this horrible ignorance, that has so far spread over this unhappy part of the country. On the other hand, what shall we say to the neglect, which for so many years past has been the occasion of this surprising darkness among the people, when the poor abandoned creatures have not so much as had the common instruction of Christianity? So much as to know whether there was any such thing as a God or no, much less how to worship Him. And if at any time any glimpse of light had been infused into them, and they had been taught any knowledge of superior things, it has been by the diligence of the popish clergy, who to do them justice, have shown more charity, and taken more pains that way, than some whose work it had been, and who it might much more have been expected from. But the state of religion is not my present subject. 'Tis certain the people have the Bible in their own language, the IRS, and the missionaries now are obliged to preach to them, and examine or catechize their children in the IRS language. So that we are not to despair of having this county as well instructed in time, as other parts of Britain. The rest must be left to His hand, that overrules the minds of men, and causes them to know, even in spite of the defects of common teaching. On this coast is the Isle of Skye, lying from the west-northwest, to the east-southeast, and bearing upon the main island, only separated by a narrow strait of water. Something like as the Isle of Wight is separated from the county of Southampton. We left this on our right, and crossing the mountains, came with as little stay as we could to the Loch of Abra, that is, the water which as I said above, assists with Loch Ness, or Loch Ness, to separate the north land of Scotland from the middle part. This is a long and narrow inlet of the sea, which opening from the Irish Sea west, meets the river Abra, or as the Scots much more properly express it, the water of Abra, for it is rather a large lake or loch, than a river, and receives innumerable small rivers into it. It begins or rises in the mountains of Ross, or of Glengarry, within 5 or 6 miles from the shore of the Loch Ness, or the water of Ness, which is a long and narrow lake like itself, and as the Ness runs away east to Inverness, and so into the great gulf called Murray Firth, so the Abra becoming presently a loch or lake, also goes away more to the southward, and sloping southwest, runs into the Irish Sea as above. From this river or water of Abra, all that mountainous barren and frightful country, which lies south of the water of Abra, is called Lochaber, or the country bordering on Loch Abra. It is indeed a frightful country full of hideous desert mountains and unpassable, except to the Highlanders who possess the precipices. Here in spite of the most vigorous pursuit, the Highland robbers, such as the famous Rob Roy in the late disturbances, find such retreats as none can pretend to follow them into, nor could he be ever taken. On this water of Abra, just at the entrance of the loch, was anciently a fort built, to curb the Highlanders, on either side. It was so situated, that though it might indeed be blocked up by land and be distressed by a siege, the troops besieging being masters of the field, yet as it was open to the sea, it might always receive supplies by shipping. The government being supposed to be always master of the sea, or at least 'tis very probable they will be so. This fort the late King William caused to be rebuilt, or rather a new fort to be erected, where there was always a good garrison kept for curbing the Highlanders, which fort was for several years commanded by Lieutenant General Maitland, an old experienced general, who had signalized himself upon many occasions abroad, particularly at the great battle of Treves, where he served under the French, and where he lost one of his hands. I name this gentleman, not to pay any compliment to him, for he is long ago in his grave, but to intimate that this wise commander did more to gain the Highlanders and keep them in peace, and in a due subjection to the British government, by his winning and obliging behavior, and yet by strict observance of his orders, and the duty of a governor, than any other before him had been able to do by force, and the sword. And this particularly appeared in the time of the Union, when endeavors were everywhere made use of, to bring those hot people to break out into rebellion, if possible to prevent the carrying on the treaty. At this place we take our leave of the 3rd Division, which I call the North Land of Scotland, for this fort being on the south side of the Loch Abra is therefore called Inner Lochie, as the other for the like reason was called Inner Ness. We have nothing now remaining for a full survey of Scotland, but the western part, of the middle part, or division of Scotland, and this though a large country, yet affords not an equal variety with the eastern part of the same division. To traverse the remaining part of this country, I must begin upon the Upper Tay, as we may justly call it, where I left off when I turned away east. And here we have in a special manner the country of Brehon, the Blair as 'tis called of Athol, and the country of Breadalbane. This is a hilly country indeed, but as it is watered by the Tay, and many other pleasant rivers which fall into it, there are also several fruitful valleys, interspersed among the hills. Nor are even the highlands themselves, or the Highlanders the inhabitants anything so wild, untaught, or untractable, as those whom I have been describing in the Northland division, that is to say, in Strathnaver, Ross, Tain, and the Duke of Athol is lord, I was almost going to say king of this country, and has the greatest interest, or if you please, the greatest share of vassalage of any nobleman in this part of Scotland. If I had said in all Scotland, I believe I should have been supported by others that know both his person and his interest as well as most people do. His Grace was always an opposer of the Union in the Parliament holden at Edinburgh, for passing it into an act, but he did not carry his opposition to the height of tumult and rebellion. If he had, as some were forward to have had done, he would have possibly bid fair, to have prevented the conclusion of it, at least at that time, but the hour was come, when the calamities of war, which had for so many hundred years vexed the two nations, were to have an end. And though the government was never weaker in power than at that time, I mean in Scotland, yet the affair was carried through with a high hand, all the little tumults and disorders of the rabble as well at Edinburgh as at Glasgow, and other places, being timely suppressed, and others by prudent management prevented. The Duke has several fine seats in this country. As first at Dunkeld, upon the Tay which I mentioned before, and where there was a fight, between the regular troops and the Highlanders, in the reign of King William, another at Huntingtour, in the Strathen, or Valley of Erne, where the Duke has a fine park, and great store of deer. And it may indeed be called his hunting seat, whither he sometimes retires merely for sport. But his ordinary residence, and where I say he keeps his court like a prince, is at the castle of Blair, farther N. And beyond the Tay, on the edge of Breadalbane upon the banks of a clear and fine river which falls into the Tay, a few miles lower. As I have said something of this country of Breadalbane, it will be needful to say something more, seeing some other authors have said so much. It is seated as near the centre of Scotland, as any part of it can be well fixed. And that which is particular, is, that it is all-edged, it is the highest ground of all Scotland, for that the rivers which rise here, are said to run every way from this part, some into the eastern, and some into the western seas. The Grampian Mountains, which are here said to cut through Scotland, as the Muscovites say of their Riphean hills, that they are the girdle of the world. As is the country, so are the inhabitants, a fierce fighting and furious kind of men. But I must add that they are much changed, and civilized from what they were formerly, if Mr. Camden's account of them is just. I mean of the Highlanders of Breadalbane only, though I include the country of Lochaber, and Athol, as adjoining to it. It is indeed a very bitter character, and possibly they might deserve it in those days. But I must insist that they are quite another people now, and though the country is the same, and the mountains as wild and desolate as ever, yet the people, by the good conduct of their chiefs and heads of clans, are much more civilized than they were in former times. As the men have the same vigor and spirit, but are under a better regulation of their manners, and more under government, so they make excellent soldiers, when they come abroad, or are listed in regular and disciplined troops. The Duke of Athol, though he has not an estate equal to some of the nobility, yet he is master of more of these superiorities, as they are called there, than many of those who have twice his estate. And I have been told, that he can bring a body of above 6,000 men together in arms at very little warning. The pomp and state in which this noble person lives, is not to be imitated in Great Britain. For he is served like a prince, and maintains a greater equipage and retinue than 5 times his estate would support in another country. The Duke has also another seat in Strathen, which is called Tullibardine, and which gives title at this time to the eldest son of the house of Athol, for the time being. At the lower part of this country, the river Erne falls into Tay, and greatly increases its waters. This river rises far west, on the frontiers of the western highlands near Glengyle, and running through that pleasant country called Strathen, falls into Tay, below St. Johnstone's. Soon after its first coming out from the mountains, the Erne spreads itself into a loch, as most of those rivers do. This is called Loch Erne, soon after which it runs by Duplin Castle, the seat of the Earl of Kinnell, whose eldest son is known in England, by the title of Lord Duplin, taking it from the name of this castle. The late Earl of Kinnell's son, the Lord Duplin, was married to the daughter of the late Earl of Oxford, then Lord High Treasurer of England, and who was on that occasion made a peer of Great Britain. This castle of Duplin, is a very beautiful seat, and the heads of the families having been pretty much used to live at home, the house has been adorned at several times, according to the genius, and particular inclination of the persons who then lived there. The present Earl is not much in Scotland, being created a peer of Great Britain, in the reign of the late Queen Anne, and married, as above, into the family of Oxford. This ancient seat is situated in a good soil, and a pleasant country, near the banks of the river Erne, and the Earl has a very good estate, but not loaded with vassals, and Highland superiorities, as the Duke of Athol is said to be. The house is now under a new decoration, 2 new wings being lately added for offices as well as ornament. The old building is spacious, the rooms are large, and the ceilings lofty, and which is more than all the appearance of the buildings, 'tis all magnificently finished, and furnished within. There are also abundance of very fine paintings, and some of great value, especially court pieces, and family pieces, of which it would take up a book to write the particulars. But I must not omit the fine picture of King Charles I, with a letter in his hand, which he holds out to his son the Duke of York, afterwards King James II, which they say he was to carry to France. Also a statue in brass of the same King Charles I on horseback. There are also two pictures of a contrary sort, namely, one of Oliver Cromwell, and one of the then General Monk, both from the life. Also there is a whole length of that Earl of Kinnell, who was Lord Chancellor of Scotland, in the reign of King James VI, with several other pieces of Italian masters of great value. From this place we went to Brehin, an ancient town with a castle finely situate, but the ancient grandeur of it not supported. The family of Penmuir, to whom it belonged, having been in no extraordinary circumstances for some time past, and now their misfortunes being finished, it is under forfeiture, and sold among the spoils of the late rebellion. We were now as it were landed again, being after a long mountain ramble, come down to the low lands, and into a pleasant and agreeable country. But as we had yet another journey to take west, we had a like prospect of a rude and wild part of Scotland to go through. The Highlands of Scotland are divided into two parts, and known so as two separate countries, viz. the West Highlands, and the North Highlands, the last, of which I have spoken at large, contain the countries or provinces of Breadalbane, Atholl, Lochaber, Buchan, Mar, Sutherland, Ross, Strathnaver, Caithness, together with the Isle of Skye. The West Highlands contain the shires or counties of Dunbritton Lennox, Bute, Dunbarton, Argyll, Lorne and Cantyre. On the bank of this river Erne lies a very pleasant vale, which continues from the Tay, where it receives the river quite up to the Highlands. This is called according to the usage of Scotland Strath Erne, or the Strath or Vale of Erne. 'Tis an agreeable country, and has many gentlemen's seats on both sides the river. But it is near the Highlands, and has often suffered by the depredations of those wild folk in former times. The family of Montrose, whose chief was sacrificed for the interest of King Charles I, had a strong castle here called Kincardine. But it was ruined and demolished in those wars, and is not rebuilt. The castle of Drummond is almost in the same condition, or at least is like soon to be so. The Earl of Perth, to whom it belongs, being in exile, as his father was before him, by their adhering to the late King James VII. And to the present Pretender. King James VII made the father a duke, and knight of the Garter, and governor to his son the Pretender. His eldest son who should have succeeded to the honours and titles died in France, and 3 other sons still remaining are all abroad, either following the ruined fortunes of the Pretender, or in other service in foreign courts. Where, we know not, nor is it material to our present purpose. The Western Highlands are the only remaining part of Scotland, which as yet I have not touched upon. This is that particular country, which a late great man in King James II's time, called the Kingdom of Argyll. And upon which occasion it was a compliment upon King James, that he had conquered 2 kings, when he suppressed the rebellion of the Whigs. Namely, the Duke of Monmouth, whom in derision they called the Little King of Lyme, and the Earl of Argyll whom they called with much more propriety, the Great King of the Highlands. It is true that the greatest part of these Western Highlands, may be said to be subject, or in some respect to belong to the House of Argyll, or to speak more properly, to the family or clan of the Campbells, of whom the Duke of Argyll is the chief. But then it should be noted too, that those Western gentlemen are not so blindly to be led, or guided by their chiefs as those in the north, nor when led on, are they so apt for mischief and violence. But as many of them are touched with the Cameronian Whig, or at least the English Whig principles, they would venture to inquire what they were to do, and whom to fight against, at least before they dipped far in any hazardous undertaking. Though the people of these countries are something more civilized than those of their brethren mountaineers in the north, yet the countries seem to be so near akin that no strangers could know them asunder. Nor is there any breach in the similitude that I could observe, except it be that in the North Highlands, there are such great woods of fir trees, which I have taken notice of there, and which we do not see the like of here, nor did we see so many or so large eagles in these western mountains as in the north, though the people assure us there are such too. The quantity of deer are much the same, and the kinds too, and the black cattle are of the same kind, and rather more numerous. The people also dress after the same manner, in the plaid and the trowse, go naked from below the knee to the mid-thighs, wear the dirk and the pistol at their girdle, and the targ or target at their shoulder. Some reckon the shire of Breadalbane to belong to these western highlands, not that it is west in its situation, for it is rather north, and as I have mentioned, is said to be the centre of Scotland. And the highest land, being in the very body of those they call the Grampian Mountains. All the reason that I could find they give for reckoning this country among the western highlands, is because they say one part of it is inhabited by the Campbells, whose clan, as I have observed, generally possesses all the West Highlands. But if they will claim the country, they must claim the people too, who are, if I may give my opinion, some of the worst, most barbarous, and ill-governed of all the Highlands of Scotland. They are desperate in fight, cruel in victory, fierce even in conversation, apt to quarrel, mischievous, and even murderers in their passion. At the fight which happened at Gillicranky, in this part of Scotland, they tell us a story of a comate between an English soldier pressed hard by a Highlander, the regiment being in disorder, for the English had the worst of it. The English soldier was singled out in the pursuit by one particular Highlander, and found himself in great danger. He defended himself with the club of his musket as long as he was able, his shot being spent before. After which they came to their swords. The English man understood the backsword very well, but the Scots man received all the blows upon his targe. So that the English man could not come in with him, and at the same time he laid hard at the English man with his broadsword, and had cut him in 2 or 3 places, at which the English man enraged, rather than discouraged, cried out to him. "You dog," says he. "Come out from behind the door and fight like a man," meaning from behind his great target. But the Scots man, though as brave as the other, knew better things than that, and laying hard at him had cut him down, and was just going to kill him, when some of the regiment that saw him distressed, came up to him and rescued him, and took the Highlander prisoner. It is hard to distinguish two among those Highland men, who are the best soldiers. Foreigners give it to the northern men as the more hardy and the larger bodies. But I will not undertake to decide this controversy. Either of them make very good soldiers, and all the world are fond of them. Nor are they equalled in any part of the world that I have met with, if they are regimented by themselves, unmixed with other nations. And here I must take an opportunity to rectify a mistake which has grown up to a vulgar error, and is an injury to the Scots. In some respect, at least it is robbing them of part of that honour, which is their due. The case is this. We have frequent occasions to hear of the fame of the Irish battalions abroad, how well they behave, and what good troops they are, how they acted in such a battle, and such. How in particular they beat the Germans out of Cremona, after they had got possession of the town, and had taken the French general, the Mares Hall Villeroy prisoner, how the Irish battalions in the Scots service behaved in Sicily. And so on many extraordinary occasions. Now though it is true that these are called Irish, because they were originally such, yet 'tis as true the men are all or most of them Scots Highlanders, who upon all occasions getting over into France, always list in the Irish troops. Nay, in the late wars it was frequent to raise whole regiments of Highlanders for the service, but when they came over, they would take the first occasion to desert, and go over to the French, so to list in the Irish battalions. For they all speak Irish, and some have affirmed, that they have first listed with that resolution, being generally addicted to the interest of King James VII. But be that so or not, this I am well assured of, viz. That most of those they call Irish in the armies of France and Spain, and to whom so many glorious actions have been justly ascribed, are to this day Scots Highlanders, or at least most of them are so, but this by the way. I am now to return to our progress. Leaving the country of Brehon, and the low lands of Strathen, we went away west, but were presently interrupted by a vast inland sea, rather than a lake called Loch Lomond. It is indeed a sea, and looked like it from the hills from whence we first descried it, and its being a tempestuous day, I assure you it appeared all in a breach, rough and raging, like the sea in a storm. There are several islands in it, which from the hills we could plainly perceive were islands, but that they are adrift, and float about the lake, that I take as I find it, for a story, namely, a story called A.F., as I do also that of the water of this loch, turning wood into stone. This lake or loch is, without comparison, the greatest in Scotland. No other can be called half so big, for it is more than 20 miles long, and generally 8 miles in breadth, though at the north end of it, 'tis not so broad by far. It receives many rivers into it, but empties itself into the Firth of Clyde. At one mouth, near the entrance of it into Clyde, stands the famous Dunbarton Castle, the most antient, as well as the most important castle in Scotland. And the gate, as 'tis called, of the Highlands. It is now not much regarded, the whole country being, as it were, buried in peace, yet there is a garrison maintained in it. And the pass would be still of great import, were there any occasion of arms in time to come. 'Tis exceeding strong by situation, being secured by the river on one side, the Firth of Clyde on the other, by an unpassable morass on the third side, and the fourth is a precipice. Passing from Dunbarton Castle, we enter the territory of Argyll. As to the county of Lennox, the paternal estate and property of the Stuarts, it lies extended from both sides the Leven, that is, the river, which, as I said before, empties the Loch Lomond into the Clyde. On this side, or eastward, Lennox joins the Monteith, and runs up for some length on the east side of the loch, and on the west side it extends to the edge of the Loch Lowing, and a great way north, almost to the mountains of Lochaber. All our writers of the description of Lennox enlarge upon the family of Stuarts, who proceeded, as by the mother, from the royal line of Scotland, so by the father, from Henry Lord Darnley, married to Mary Queen of Scots. And afterwards basely murdered by her, or by her order and direction. By this Lord Darnley, who was son and heir apparent to Matthew, Earl of Lennox, this whole estate, with the title, devolved at last upon King Charles II, who gave the title to one of his natural sons, with the addition of Duke. Beyond this Loch Lowing begins the large extended country of Argyll, or the Western Highlands, whose extent takes in the shire or county of Lorne to the north, and Cantyre to the south, all possessed by the Campbells. And vulgarly understood by the country of Argyll. For as for Cantyre, which is a Chersonese, or peninsula, it belongs mostly, if not wholly to the Campbells, and as to Lorne, 'tis the title of the eldest son of the house of Argyll to this day. The west side of this country lies extended along the Irish Sea for a very great length, at least 80 miles, viz., from the Mull of Cantyre to Dunstaffnage, and the Isle of Stacker and Lisnock, in the water of Lochaber. On all this shore there is no town eminent for trade, no port or harbour, at least none made use of for shipping. Nor are there any ships to require them, except fishing barks and boats, which are in the season employed for catching herrings, of which the shoals that are found upon this coast in the season are incredible, especially in the Clyde, in Loch Fyne, and about the Isle of Arran, which lies in the mouth of Clyde. From the Mull of Cantyre they see Ireland very plain, it being not above 15 or 16 miles from the point of land, which they call the Mull, to the fair foreland, on the coast of Coleraine, on the north of Ireland. In the mouth of this Sea of Clyde lies a rock, somewhat like the base in the Firth of Forth, or of Edinburgh, not for shape, but for this particular, that here, as at the base, the Solent geese are pleased to come in the season of the fishery, and to breed and inhabit as they do at the base, and to go away and come again just at the same seasons, as at the base. This island is called the Ailes. Here are also the islands of Arran and of Bute. The first giving title of Earl to the family of Hamilton, and the other the title of Duke of Rothesay to the eldest son of the crown of Scotland, who is called Duke of Rothesay, from the castle of Rothesay in this island. Nor is there anything else considerable to be said of either of the islands. For as for their present condition, which is what is my particular business in this book, they have nothing considerable in or about them, except it be a tumultuous and dangerous sea for sailors, especially when a southwest wind blows hard. which brings the sea rolling in upon them in a frightful manner. However, there is one good harbour on the north side of the island, called Lamlac, which is their safety in such cases. Off of the western shore of Argyll and Lorne there are abundance of islands, which all belong to the family of Argyll, or at least to its jurisdiction, as Isla, Jura, Tiri, Mull, Lismore, Coll, and several others of less note.